That sheriff looked right at me, and his eyes had this sickening pity in them. He said, "Mr. Pendleton, I'm so sorry, but your daughter-in-law has been killed in a car wreck." I stared right back into his eyes and said perfectly calm, "Sheriff, you've got the wrong house. I only have one child, a son named Julian, and he's doing just fine. As for a daughter-in-law, he married a Silicon Valley tech executive, and that woman is probably sitting in some glass mansion in Austin right now, drinking cold-pressed juice." The sheriff just shook his head and handed me a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was a custom wrench keychain, slightly blackened by fire, and a cheap burner phone with a shattered screen. He told me the car went off a cliff down by the Blanco River. He said there was only one contact saved in that phone, under the name Pop. It was my number. When they unzipped that black body bag in the impound yard morgue, my legs almost gave out from under me. It really wasn't my son's current wife, but looking at her lifeless face, my heart broke completely. The woman lying on that cold stainless steel table was someone who was supposed to have vanished 5 years ago. And as my eyes traced the unnatural bruising along the side of her neck and the dark fibers trapped under her fingernails, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no accidental fall over a cliff. My name is Arthur Pendleton, but most folks call me Art. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 35 long years working as a foreman on the oil rigs out in West Texas. I know the smell of trouble when it's coming. Trouble doesn't knock politely on your door at 5 in the morning. It hits you like a runaway drill bit, trying to tear your whole life apart. When the heavy pounding started at my front door, I didn't reach for my glasses on the nightstand. Instead, I grabbed the heavy steel wrench I keep under my mattress. Ever since my wife, Martha, passed away from an illness 7 years ago, I've slept with one eye open. I walked across the old hardwood floor toward the front entryway, my worn-out knees clicking with every single step. The red and blue lights of a police cruiser flashed through the blinds, painting my living room walls in violent colors. I slid the chain lock open just an inch. 2 officers stood on the porch. The younger one looked straight out of the academy, still chewing on a piece of gum, while the older sheriff looked completely exhausted, with heavy bags under his eyes. "Mr. Arthur Pendleton?" the young one asked. "That's me," I said, keeping a tight grip on the wrench. "Sir, we need you to come with us. It's regarding your daughter-in-law." I frowned and told them my son Julian lived in a wealthy, gated community in Austin. I told them if something happened to his family, they should be at his mansion, not at my run-down ranch that smells like motor oil. The older sheriff stepped forward. "Sir, the ID on the victim reads Elena Reyes. Her emergency contact listed was you. She was found in a canyon off Interstate 10. The vehicle caught fire, and the initial determination is that she fell asleep at the wheel and went over the edge. Elena!" That name hit me like a sledgehammer right to the chest. The wrench slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. It couldn't be. Elena was the girl who used to apprentice at my auto shop, the girl who always had grease on her hands but a smile brighter than the Texas sun. She was the girl who secretly loved my son Julian for 8 long years, only to vanish 5 years ago without a single word of goodbye after Julian left her for a tech mogul's daughter. I sat in the back of the police car watching the dark desert fly past the window. The pre-dawn Texas air was freezing, and the dry wind kicked up dust, but it couldn't sweep away the darkness hanging over this land. I tried calling Julian, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course it did. He was probably asleep in his temperature-controlled leather bed next to his perfect wife, Caroline, dreaming about his company going public and making millions. He had forgotten all about Elena a long time ago, but I never did. The county medical examiner's office was a place filled with the smell of chemicals and pure despair. The cold in that room wasn't just the temperature. It was a deep silence that sank straight into your bones. The coroner was a short man wearing thick glasses, looking down at his tablet. He said, "Jane Doe, tentatively identified as Elena Reyes. Cause of death appears to be a broken neck from a vehicle plunging off a cliff, followed by thermal damage. We recovered her from the driver's seat." He unzipped the body bag, and the sound seemed to echo like a scream in that quiet room. Then he pulled back the white sheet. I had to grip the edge of the examination table just to keep from collapsing. It was her. It really was her. She looked much older than I remembered. The cheeks that used to be full were hollow now, and her black hair, which she always wore in a ponytail, was cut very short, with the tips singed by fire. But I could never mistake that face. There was a tiny scar right above her left eyebrow from a stray bolt that flew off a transmission when she was 19. I was the one who bandaged it for her. "Is she family?" the sheriff asked quietly. I swallowed the lump in my throat. In every way that truly mattered, I said, "Yes, she's my daughter." I reached out, wanting to touch the back of her hand. Her fingers were cold and stiff. I remembered how warm her hands used to be, how she would bring me a cup of hot black coffee on freezing winter mornings and sit by the stove, listening to my old stories about the oil rigs. Julian always found my stories boring, but Elena would listen for hours. "Why did you leave, sweetheart?" I whispered to myself. "Why did you hide away?" The coroner sighed impatiently, checking his watch. "Sir, if you've confirmed the identity, we can close the case. This is a textbook accident. Late night, fatigue, missing a sharp turn sign. This happens on Interstate 10 every single week." I felt a wave of anger rush straight to my head, hot and sharp. Don't talk about her like she's some careless person who nodded off. She was a master mechanic. She knew cars better than she knew her own hands. She could drive that road with her eyes closed. The coroner shrugged. "People get tired. The scene investigation is clear. There are no skid marks. She went straight over." I looked at her again. Really looked. I might be old, but my eyes are still sharp. I spent decades on those oil rigs inspecting equipment for fatal flaws, and I know how to spot the details other people miss. I looked closely at her neck. Beneath the terrible burns and scrapes, there was a highly unnatural mark. It was a faint, deep purple bruise right over her windpipe, exactly the size and shape of a man's thumb. "Wait a minute," I pointed at the mark. "What's that?" The coroner glanced at it carelessly. "Post-mortem pooling. Or maybe she hit the steering wheel when the car rolled. It doesn't mean anything." "It means everything," I said, raising my voice. "That's a bruise." Someone had their hand around her neck. The younger officer chimed in. "Mr. Pendleton, you're upset. We understand this is emotional, but there's no evidence of foul play at the scene. The car doors were locked from the inside." I took one last look at Elena's face, and then my eyes fell on the clear bag the sheriff had shown me earlier. I took out the custom wrench keychain. It was a gift I gave her the day she finished her apprenticeship. Solid steel wrapped in hand-stitched leather. She had cried back then, saying it was the most precious thing she'd ever owned, and promised she'd keep it with her forever. Elena was an incredibly cautious person. She would never just drive off a cliff without trying to brake. "This wasn't an accident," I said firmly, turning to look at the officers. "This woman was harmed. Someone staged this crash." The room went dead silent. The coroner and the sheriff exchanged a weary glance. "Mr. Pendleton," the sheriff's tone lost its pity, turning a bit sharp. "I know this is hard to accept, but facts are facts. Once the final report comes in, the conclusion isn't going to change." I looked back at that bruise. It wasn't just a mark, it was a print. Someone had pressed their thumb down hard against her throat. Maybe not to end her life right then, but to control her, to knock her out before the car went over. I moved closer to her hand, and that's when I noticed another tiny detail. Under the fingernail of her right index finger, there was a tiny black fiber, like the material from a pair of expensive tactical gloves. She had fought back. I pointed it out to them. "Look under her fingernails." The coroner sighed, picked up a magnifying glass for a brief second, and then stepped back. "Just charred material from the car seats. Look, sir, we're done here. You can contact a funeral home tomorrow to arrange things." They were brushing me off. To them, I was just a stubborn old man who couldn't accept reality, and Elena was just another number in the traffic accident statistics. They just wanted to file the paperwork and go home. But I couldn't just leave her like this. 5 years ago, I thought Julian needed to focus on his career, so I went along with his betrayal and watched Elena leave with a broken heart. When Julian married that tech heiress, Caroline, I stayed quiet for the sake of my son's so-called future. My silence had ruined Elena's life. I placed my rough hand on her cold forehead. "I promise you, sweetheart, I whispered. "I won't let them bury the truth with you." By the time I walked out of the medical examiner's office, the harsh Texas sun was already up. The wind felt like a blade against my face. Holding the bag with her things, I sat on the hood of my truck and pulled out that cheap phone with the shattered screen. It was a burner phone, the kind you buy at a gas station for $30. The battery was almost dead. I hit the power button, and the screen flickered to life. Sure enough, it was locked with a passcode, but Elena was a sentimental person, and I knew her habits. I tried her birthday. Incorrect. I tried Julian's birthday. Incorrect. Then I remembered a date that meant everything to both of us, the day my wife, Martha, passed away. On that day, Elena was the one who held my hand through the entire service. I typed in the numbers, 0914. The screen unlocked, and my heart started hammering against my ribs. I went straight to the photo gallery. There were no selfies, no pictures of scenery, just a single folder containing one video. The timestamp showed it was recorded less than 3 hours before the police estimated the car went over the cliff. I pressed play. Elena's face filled the cracked screen. She was crying, her face pale with absolute terror. The background looked like the inside of some abandoned trailer, and she kept her voice dropped so low it sounded like death itself was standing right outside the door. "Art!" she choked out, a sob catching in her throat. "If you're seeing this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry I stayed hidden from you. I had to. That woman threatened to take him away forever." "Take him away? Who was she talking about?" The camera shook violently as Elena glanced toward the door before turning back to the lens. "I hid him, Art. He's safe for now. But you have to reach him before she does." I stitched the key to the storage locker right into the lining of the back seat. "Please, Art. He has Julian's eyes. He has that same stubborn streak you do." The video cut to black. I sat there on that blistering hood, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He has Julian's eyes. Elena hadn't left alone all those years ago. She had fled while she was expecting, and she had been raising this child all on her own. I looked down at the clear evidence bag and poured the contents into my hand. The keychain, the phone. The police said everything at the scene was destroyed. But I knew Elena. I knew exactly where she would hide the things that truly mattered. I stood up. The ache in my knees was gone, and the exhaustion of a sleepless night vanished completely. All I felt was a fire burning deep in my chest, a spark that had been dark for a long time, now roaring back to life. I wasn't just a retired oil rig worker anymore. I was a father, and now I was a grandfather. The authorities wanted to call it a closed case, but as far as I was concerned, the fight had just begun. Instead of heading home, I drove the truck straight to the county impound lot. The midday sun made the chain-link fence scorching hot to the touch. The old watchman was nodding off in his chair, so I slid a $100 bill across his desk. I told him I just wanted one last look at my daughter-in-law's truck, to retrieve a few personal items. He didn't even blink before letting me through. The Ford pickup was unrecognizable, a massive skeleton of blackened steel. I climbed into the back seat, breathing in the heavy, suffocating scent of smoke and burnt metal. Elena said the key was in the lining. I pulled out my pocket knife and sliced through the half-melted leather. Deep inside the yellowed insulation foam, the tip of my blade struck something solid. It was an old brass key stamped with the number 804, right next to a small Greyhound Bus Depot logo. I stood up and scanned the perimeter. Just outside the impound lot, a black SUV parked in the distance caught my eye. The windows had an incredibly dark tint. The moment I looked its way, the vehicle slowly pulled away and disappeared down the highway. They were still watching. Destroying Elena wasn't enough. They were still searching for the one piece of evidence that could bring their whole world crashing down. I took off down the highway, heading straight for the Greyhound station in El Paso. It was a gritty place filled with travelers and the heavy smell of cheap tobacco. I located locker 804, slid the brass key into the slot, and turned it. The door clicked open. Inside sat a single faded canvas duffel bag. I pulled the zipper back. There was no money, no clothes, just a thick stack of documents, a portable hard drive, and a handwritten note with a set of GPS coordinates. I threw the bag onto the passenger seat and slammed on the gas, heading deep into the heart of the Chihuahuan desert. According to the coordinates, the destination was an abandoned mining area so remote it didn't even show up on updated satellite maps. The dirt road was so incredibly rough, it felt like it was rattling my bones loose. After driving for nearly 2 hours, I spotted a rusted Airstream trailer, tucked away behind a wall of weathered red rock. There was no electricity, and a heavy silence hung over the area. My hand instinctively reached for the heavy wrench at my waist. "Anyone out here?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and dry in the desert air. Nothing. I walked up to the door and saw the lock had been violently pried open. When I pushed it wide, the sight inside made me catch my breath. It wasn't just messy. The place had been systematically ransacked. The mattress was slashed to ribbons. The cabinet doors were ripped off their hinges, and the floor was covered in broken glass and spilled cereal. Someone had been searching this place with absolute desperation. Down on the linoleum floor near the kitchen, I spotted a clear footprint from a tactical boot. It was at least a size 12. Elena wore a size 7. Dangerous men had been here, and they hadn't cared about leaving tracks because they assumed whoever lived here was already taken care of. That's when I heard it. It was a tiny sound, faint as a mouse scratching behind a wall. I held my breath, fixing my eyes on a small, cramped storage closet at the very back of the trailer that was blocked by debris. The wooden door was shut tight, its metal handle badly bent out of shape. It looked like someone had tried to force it open but gave up or ran out of time. I stepped over the wreckage, gripped the bent handle, and pulled with everything I had. With a harsh, scraping screech, the door gave way. The closet was piled high with old coats and cardboard boxes. At first, I couldn't see a thing, just shadows. But just as I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, a sharp gasp came from behind a plastic storage bin in the deepest corner. I slowly dropped to one knee and moved the heavy winter coats aside. Right there, tucked away, was a little girl. She looked to be no more than 5 years old, curled tightly into a ball like a discarded doll. She was wearing pajamas covered in cartoon dinosaurs, but they were covered in dust. She was trembling, not from the temperature, but from a deep, bone-chilling terror that shook her entire frame. She looked up at me, and for a second the air left my lungs. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She just stared at me with those wide, terrified eyes. Her tiny hands were clamped tightly over her own mouth, as if someone had taught her that making even a single sound meant danger. "Hey there, little one," I said, keeping my voice as soft and gentle as I could, trying not to frighten her. "I'm not going to hurt you." She pressed herself even harder into the corner, trying to vanish into the wall. Her eyes darted to my hands, checking to see if I was holding anything dangerous. This was a child who already knew what fear felt like, and that broke my heart even more than seeing the wreckage of the truck. I sat right down on the dusty floor, keeping my distance to give her space. "My name is Art," I said. "I'm a friend of Elena's. I know your mama." The moment she heard her mother's name, heavy tears began to roll down her cheeks, but she kept her hands pressed firmly over her mouth, refusing to make a sound. She pointed a trembling finger toward the torn-up bed outside. "Yeah," I said, swallowing the bitterness in my throat. "I know. I'm so sorry I didn't get here sooner. But those people are gone now. It's just me." I remembered I had a peppermint candy in my pocket, something I kept on hand for my blood sugar. I slowly unwrapped the cellophane, showing her my open palms so she could see I wasn't a threat. I slid the candy across the floor toward her. She looked at the candy, then back up at me. Hunger finally won out over fear. She reached out, snatched it up, and popped it into her mouth. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked. She chewed for a moment before answering in a voice as soft as a whisper. "Maya." "Maya?" I repeated. "That's a beautiful, strong name." I reached out my hand. "Come on, Maya. We can't stay here. It isn't safe." She hesitated, looking toward the open door of the trailer, as if expecting something terrible to walk through at any second. And maybe she was right. The people who went after Elena hadn't found what they were looking for. It clicked in my mind right then. They hadn't torn this place apart looking for documents or files. They were looking for her. They wanted to erase every single trace of Elena's existence. In her final moments, Elena had locked her daughter away in this hidden space, using her own vehicle to draw the trackers away and onto that highway, giving her little girl a chance to survive. "Come on, Maya," I urged softly. She crawled out from behind the boxes. As the sunlight from the doorway hit her face, I finally got a clear look at her features, and the room felt like it was spinning. It wasn't just that she was a beautiful child. It was the curve of her nose, the shape of her jaw, and above all, her eyes. They were a deep amber color, flecked with gold. They weren't Elena's eyes, and they weren't mine. They were Julian's eyes. There was no way I could ever mistake them. I looked into those eyes the day Julian was born. I looked into them when he graduated college, and I looked into them when he lied to my face to cover his debts. This terrified little girl hiding in a broken-down desert trailer was my own granddaughter. A massive wave of anger and disbelief hit me like a physical blow. Elena had been raising my granddaughter all alone in poverty and fear, while Julian was living the high life in a glass mansion in Austin. Did Julian even know? Had he abandoned them, or had Elena kept him in the dark to protect the child? Maya looked up at me, waiting for me to move. She reached out a dusty little hand and wrapped her fingers around my pinky. Her grip was incredibly tight. "Are you a bad man?" she asked timidly. Tears stung the corners of my eyes. I've been called a lot of things in my life, sweetheart. Stubborn, difficult, set in my ways. But looking down at her, I knew I had a brand new title. Protector. "No, Maya," I said, scooping her up into my arms. She was so light I could feel her ribs through the fabric of her pajamas. "I'm not a bad man. I'm your granddad, and nobody is ever going to hurt you again." I stood up, holding her close. She smelled like dust and fear, but beneath it all was just the innocent scent of a child. She buried her face into my shoulder, and for the very first time since I stepped into that trailer, she let out a loud sob, her tiny body shaking against me. I took off my jacket and wrapped it around her, covering her face so no one could see her. I carried her out of that ruined trailer and never looked back. The medical examiner wanted to call it an accident, and the police blamed it on fatigue. But I knew the truth now. You don't lock your daughter away in a hidden compartment in the desert if you're just planning to have a mishap on the road. You do it because you know the threat is already at your front door. Elena was taken from us because of this little girl, because someone wanted them both gone from this earth. As my boots crunched against the dry gravel toward the truck, I didn't make any legal vows, and I didn't pray to any higher power. I made a promise to the woman who gave everything to keep my bloodline alive. "I promise you, Elena, I'm going to bring their whole world down. I'm going to find out exactly who sent those people. I'm going to find out exactly how much Julian knew. And if my own son had a hand in this, may he find forgiveness elsewhere, because he won't find it from me." I settled Maya into the passenger seat of the truck, securing her tightly with the seatbelt. She looked so incredibly small and lost. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're going to ask some questions, Maya, and we're going to get some answers." I turned the key, and the old engine roared to life. But before I could even pull onto the main road, a sight in the rearview mirror made my blood run cold. That same black SUV from the impound lot was sitting right on the ridge at the end of the dirt road. As my truck began to move, its high beams flashed on, gleaming like the eyes of a predator. They were watching me. They had followed me all the way out into this wasteland, waiting to see if I would find the girl. I gripped the steering wheel tight and slammed my foot onto the gas. "Hold on, Maya," I said through my teeth. The pursuit was on. But those people had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they were tracking an old man and a defenseless child. They didn't realize they had just awakened a sleeping giant. I took Maya straight to my old friend Doc. He was a medic back in our oil field days, a man I'd trust with my life. I told him to lock the doors, pull the blinds, and ignore anyone who came knocking until I got back. I couldn't bring a child into the storm that was coming. Julian lived in a wealthy enclave in Austin, the kind of exclusive neighborhood that serves as a playground for tech executives and Silicon Valley elite. His futuristic villa, a massive structure of glass and concrete, looked like a sterile fortress. Everything about the place screamed money, but it whispered absolute isolation. The private security guard at the gate instinctively reached for the taser at his waist when my mud-splattered Ford pickup pulled up. He spent a good few minutes confirming my identity over his headset before the massive gates slowly parted, almost like an act of charity. I parked my old truck right next to Julian's brand new Porsche. My vehicle looked like a giant blot of dirt sitting on a sheet of flawless marble. Taking a deep breath, I reached into my pocket to make sure the digital recorder I bought at a pawn shop on the way over was turned on. I might be getting old, but I am far from stupid. In a fight like this, words are ammunition, and I wanted a record of every single bullet they fired. An expressionless housekeeper answered the door. She led me into a massive living room with ceilings that had to be 20 feet high. The air conditioning was turned down so incredibly low that the sweat on my back turned to ice instantly. And there was Julian. He was standing right by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a year. Holding a glass of expensive whiskey, he looked like the absolute poster child for the American dream. But the moment he turned around, I saw the truth. 他的眼眶通红，端着旧杯的手在微微发抖，冰块撞击玻璃发出清脆的响声。他知道了，不知怎么的，他已经长话短说知道了。Pop. His voice sounded as thin and dry as a dead leaf. What are you doing here? You should have called first. Caroline is preparing for the IPO roadshow tomorrow. She's under an incredible amount of stress, and she's resting. I stood there in my mud-stained work boots on his spotless wool rug, looking at the son I taught to ride a bike and change a tire. Somewhere along the way, his spine had gone completely soft. I'm not here to see your wife, Julian, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I came to talk to you about Elena. The moment that name left my mouth, Julian flinched as if he'd been hit with a live wire. He swallowed a massive gulp of his drink, trying to look composed, but he was failing miserably. Elena, he said, his voice shaking. I haven't heard that name in years. What about her? Did she come asking you for money again? I told you, Pop. She's just using you. I took a step closer, close enough to smell the panic on him. She's gone, Julian. The glass slipped right through his fingers. There was no dramatic slow motion like you see in the movies. It just smashed heavily against the floor, shattering into 1,000 diamond-like pieces. The whiskey splattered all over his expensive Italian leather shoes. Julian stared blankly at the broken glass on the floor, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. His face turned a sickly, pale gray. Gone? He whispered. Yeah, I said. Her car went off a cliff into a canyon and caught fire. The police are calling it fatigue. Julian looked up, and for just a single second, I saw real, genuine grief in his eyes. I saw a glimpse of the boy who had truly loved Elena before greed swallowed his soul whole. He took a step toward me. An accident? No, that's impossible. She promised me she'd stay hidden. She swore that as long as He cut himself off abruptly, realizing he had just said far too much. As long as you what, Julian? I asked, my boots making a harsh scraping sound as I stepped on the broken glass. As long as you paid her to stay quiet, as long as you threatened her. I never threatened her, he shouted, panic taking over his voice. I was just trying to protect the life I have now. You don't understand, Pop. Caroline's money, her father's connections, the launch tomorrow. Julian, darling, why is there shattered glass all over the rug? A voice as cold as a razor blade sliced through the room. I looked up to see Caroline walking down the floating staircase from the second floor. She didn't look like she was walking. She looked like she was gliding. She wore a minimalist silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She looked like an ice queen, beautiful, freezing, and dangerous. She reached the bottom of the stairs, glanced at the mess on the floor, and then looked directly at me. Her blue eyes held absolutely no warmth. They were as flat and empty as the eyes of a shark. "Hello, Arthur," she said. "What brings someone like you to our home?" Looking at her made a chill run straight down my spine. This woman was incredibly dangerous. Julian was merely weak, but Caroline was an entirely different kind of creature. She was the type of person who believed rules were meant to control others, never herself. "I came to tell Julian that Elena is gone," I said, staring her down. Caroline didn't even blink. There was no gasp, no fake shock. She simply walked over to the bar and poured herself a glass of sparkling water. "Is that so?" she said evenly. "Well, in a way, I suppose that's a poetically tragic end." "Tragic?" I repeated, my blood starting to boil. "A young woman lost her life. A woman who, before you showed up, was supposed to be a part of this family." Caroline let out a dry, humorless laugh. "A part of the family? Oh, Arthur, you're always so incredibly emotional. She was just a mistake from Julian's past. A loose thread that refused to be snipped away." She turned around, leaning against the bar, and looked at Julian, who was still trembling. "Clean yourself up, Julian. You look absolutely pathetic right now." Then she turned her gaze back to me. "So her luck finally ran out. I always wondered how long she could keep hiding. For 5 years, we paid her $10,000 every single month just to stay invisible. I guess she finally realized that no amount of money can fix a flawed existence." I clenched my fists so tight my fingernails dug deep into my palms. "You paid her to disappear." "We paid for her silence," Caroline corrected smoothly. "There is a distinct difference. Your son is a rising star in the tech world, and my father's fund cannot tolerate even a whisper of scandal. Tomorrow is the IPO launch, and we couldn't have some mechanic girl coming out of the woodwork to ruin the perfect image Julian has built." "She wasn't just some mechanic girl," I roared, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "She was a good woman, and this was no accident." Caroline's expression changed instantly. The boredom vanished, replaced by a sharp, lethal alertness. "I'd watch your words very carefully if I were you, Arthur." I stepped closer to her. I saw the bruising on her neck. I saw the fibers from tactical gloves under her fingernails. Someone knocked her out and staged that wreck to settle the score once and for all. Caroline set her water glass down. She walked right up to me, coming so close I could smell the expensive perfume masking something rotten underneath. "Let me give you a piece of advice, old man," she whispered. "You are a retired laborer living on a meager pension covered in motor oil. You have a quiet life ahead of you. Don't go playing detective and ruin what little you have left." "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "I'm educating you." She smiled, but the warmth never reached her eyes. "The authorities have closed the case. The paperwork is signed, and Elena is gone. The debt is settled. If you insist on digging things up, you might just find yourself buried right alongside them." She reached out and brushed a speck of dust off my old canvas work jacket. "Go back to your ranch, Arthur. Drink your cheap beer, fix your broken tractors, and forget all about Elena. It's better for everyone, especially you." I looked over at Julian. He was staring at his wife with pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't even grieving for Elena anymore. He was just terrified of Caroline. He was a complete hostage in his own home. I looked back at Caroline. "You really think money buys everything, don't you?" "I know for a fact that money buys everything," she replied. "Now get out of my house before I have security remove you for trespassing." I turned around and walked toward the massive front door. Part of me wanted to smash every single expensive thing in that room to pieces, but I kept my composure. Right at the threshold, I stopped and looked back, pointing at the shattered glass near Julian's feet. "You missed a spot," I said. "The mess isn't entirely cleaned up yet." I stepped out into the heavy Texas heat, and the massive oak door slammed shut behind me. I climbed into my truck and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. I was shaking, not from fear, but from the pure adrenaline of standing face to face with absolute malice. She had admitted it. She admitted to paying Alana off and wanting her gone, and she had threatened me. But she made one mistake, a massive, fatal mistake. She hadn't said a single word about the child. She talked about settling debts and cutting loose threads, but she never mentioned Maya. That meant one of two things. Either she was too arrogant to even know Maya existed, or she did know, and she assumed the people she sent to that trailer had already taken care of it. She thought Maya was gone too. I pulled the recorder from my pocket and hit the stop button. I had her voice, and I had her threats. It wasn't enough to put her away for what happened to Elna, but it was a start. I took one last look at that glass mansion. It looked like an impenetrable fortress, but every fortress has a crack. Caroline thought she had won. She thought she had scared off an old country worker. She had no idea that this old man had absolutely nothing left to lose. I shifted into gear. I needed to get back to Maya. As long as that little girl was drawing breath, Caroline's victory was nothing but a lie. And the moment she realized Maya was still alive, she would unleash absolute hell. That was just fine with me, I thought, as I drove through the gates. I've spent plenty of time in hard places throughout my life. I know the terrain well. Let them come. For one single evening, I actually allowed myself to hope that the hardest part was behind us. I brought Maya back to my old ranch. It was a far cry from the mansions in Austin. The paint on the porch was peeling, and the floorboards groaned under your boots. But it was a home. The rooms smelled of old motor oil and the cinnamon Martha used to use when she baked apple pies. I made Maya a grilled cheese sandwich, and she ate it down fast, like she hadn't seen a real meal in days. Watching her, a warmth flooded my chest that I hadn't felt since Julian was a little boy. Maya sat at my weathered kitchen table, her little legs swinging in the air. She looked over at the photos on the mantelpiece, pointing to a picture of me covered in grease on an oil rig from my younger days. "Is that you, Granddad?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "That was a long time ago, back before my knees gave out and my hair turned white. Were you a big hero?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I nearly choked on my coffee. "No, sweetheart," I said. "I'm just an ordinary man who worked hard to put food on the table. The real heroes are the ones who keep going, gritting their teeth, even when the world tries its absolute best to break them." I got her settled into the guest room for the night. It used to be Julian's room. I sat in the rocking chair out in the hallway for hours, just listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like my life actually had a purpose again. I was going to raise this girl. I'd teach her how to fix cars, how to be a person of her word, and make damn sure she grew up nothing like her father. But I was entirely too naive. I thought I was fighting a fair fight. I thought having the truth on my side meant I would win. I forgot that in this country the truth comes with a massive price tag, and my pockets were completely empty. The knock at the door came at exactly 8 in the morning. It wasn't the frantic pounding of someone looking for trouble. It was the short, sharp rap of authority, the kind of knock that doesn't request permission but commands you to open up. I opened the door. Standing on the porch was a woman in a gray suit holding a tablet. Behind her stood 2 local sheriff's deputies, hands resting flat on their utility belts. They hadn't drawn their weapons yet, but the threat was loud and clear. "Mr. Arthur Pendleton?" The woman's voice was flat, professional, and freezing cold. "That's me," I said, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind me. I didn't want Maya waking up to this. "I'm Ms. Sterling with Texas Child Protective Services. We received a report this morning concerning the welfare of a minor currently under your care." I felt my stomach drop like a stone. A report? Elena hadn't even been gone 48 hours. "What kind of report?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "The child is my granddaughter. Her mother just passed away, and I am her only living relative." Ms. Sterling looked down at her tablet, not even bothering to look up. "According to the report, you have a history of volatile behavior and show early signs of undiagnosed dementia. The report also states that your ranch is an environmental hazard filled with toxic chemicals and heavy metals from motor oil and scrap parts, making it unfit for a child. Furthermore, it claims you leave unsecured firearms within easy reach of a minor." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Volatile behavior, dementia, that is an absolute load of garbage. My ranch is cleaner than most people's hearts. My hunting rifles are locked inside a heavy steel safe in the basement, and my mind is perfectly sharp. Ma'am, you are being used as a weapon. Ms. Sterling finally looked up, her eyes tired. She had probably heard every excuse under the sun. "Mr. Pendleton, we aren't here to debate the facts. We are here to execute an emergency removal order. We need to take the child into custody pending a full investigation." "You'll have to go through me first," I said, blocking the doorway. The 2 deputies stepped forward. The taller one drew his taser, pointing it forward. "Sir, step back," he warned. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the strain. You're tearing a terrified child who just lost her mother away from the only family she has left. You're throwing her into a cold system that doesn't care whether she lives or dies. Who filed this report? Was it a woman named Caroline? Tell me. We are not at liberty to disclose the reporter's identity, Miss Sterling said coldly. Now please bring the child out, or the officers will enter by force. I stood there like a wall blocking the entrance. I am a 68-year-old man. My back aches when it rains, and my hands shake when I'm exhausted. But in that exact moment, I felt like I could take on the entire world. I wanted to swing my fists, smash that tablet, and scream at the pure injustice of it all. But right then, the door creaked open behind me. "Granddad?" I spun around. Maya stood there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, clutching an old teddy bear I had found for her. She looked at me, then her eyes darted to the uniforms. She saw the cold, stern faces. She started to scream. It wasn't just crying. It was a shriek of absolute, unfiltered terror. She thought the dangerous people had come back for her, that they were going to do to her what they did to her mama. As she rushed forward, wrapping her tiny arms around my leg, gripping me with everything she had. "No!" she shrieked over and over. "No, don't let them!" "It's okay, Maya, it's okay," I said, bending down to shield her with my body. Ms. Sterling stepped up. "Officers, secure the child." One of the deputies reached out, violently tearing Maya away from my leg. Maya kicked wildly, sinking her teeth hard into the back of the deputy's hand. "Get your hands off her," I roared, grabbing the deputy's arm. It was a critical mistake. The next second I was shoved hard against the wall, the back of my head striking the siding with a dull thud. The other deputy aimed the red laser dot of his taser directly at the center of my chest. "Back off, old man," he yelled. "Move again and you're going to jail for assaulting an officer." I froze. The red dot danced right over my heart. If I fought back, they would arrest me. I'd be locked in a cell, completely useless to Maya. I'd be a convicted felon. Caroline would win. That was exactly what she wanted. For me to push back, to prove that the angry, unstable old man in her report was real. I slowly raised my open palms, my entire body shaking with a violent, consuming rage. "It's going to be okay, Maya," I shouted over her screams as they carried her down the steps. "It's okay. Go with them. I'm coming to get you. I swear to you." Maya reached her little hand out toward me. "Granddad, help me. Granddad." Her voice broke completely. They threw her into the back seat of a white sedan, and Ms. Sterling climbed in right next to her. The door slammed shut, cutting off the sound and severing the connection between us. I stood on the porch, gasping for air. The deputy lowered his taser. "You got lucky today, old man. Next time you lay a hand on an officer, you'll be leaving in a body bag. Mind your own business." They climbed into their cruiser and tore down the road. Watching the taillights vanish into the distance, the silence that followed was absolutely deafening. The house that had been filled with warmth just minutes ago now felt exactly like a tomb. I collapsed onto the porch steps, burying my face in my rough, calloused hands. This was how they operated. This was how they broke you down. They didn't need to send thugs to burn your house to the ground. They just needed to make a phone call. They weaponized the law, using a system meant to protect the vulnerable, to crush ordinary people like us. Caroline didn't just want to take the child, she wanted to break me. She wanted to show me that no matter how hard I fought, I was absolutely powerless against her wealth and influence. She could snap her fingers, and the state would do her dirty work for her. I looked down at my hands, hands covered in calluses and old scars. These hands had operated multi-ton drilling rigs. They had held my dying wife's hand, and just now they had failed to hold on to a terrified little girl. A single tear rolled down my cheek. I wiped it away with a sharp, angry motion. "Cry when it's over," I told myself. I stood up. The back of my head was throbbing where it hit the wall. Caroline thought this was checkmate. She thought taking Maya would destroy my resolve, leaving me to give up and fade away quietly. But she forgot one fundamental rule. You never back a wounded animal into a corner. I walked back inside and went into the kitchen. The half-eaten grilled cheese sandwich was still sitting on the table. I didn't throw it out. I wrapped it up carefully and put it in the fridge. My movements were deliberate, incredibly calm. I went down to the basement and opened the dusty safe. Inside was a small metal box containing $5,000 in cash. savings I'd put away in case of a medical emergency. It wasn't enough to hire a top-tier lawyer, and it certainly wasn't enough to sway a judge, but it was more than enough to buy information, and it was enough to keep my truck gassed up. I was done playing by their rules. I tried being a law-abiding citizen. I tried trusting the badge, and look where it got me. My granddaughter was locked away somewhere, crying out my name. I grabbed the cash and threw on my worn-out, olive-drab canvas jacket. Miss Sterling said there would be an investigation, that there would be hearings. That would take weeks, maybe months. I didn't have months. Neither did Maya. I was going to get her back, and I wasn't asking for anyone's permission ever again. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in over a decade. "Yeah?" a gruff, gravelly voice answered after 3 rings. "Doc," I said, "it's Art." "Art?" The voice sounded genuinely surprised. "I figured you were already 6 feet under." "Not yet," I said, "but I need a favor. I need you to find someone. A woman named Sterling works for Child Protective Services. I need to know exactly where she took that little girl." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Is this real trouble, Art? The kind you don't walk away from?" "Every bit of it," I said. "Good," Doc replied. I was getting bored anyway. I hung up the phone and looked over at the empty bed where Maya had slept just hours before. "Hold on, my little desert flower. Granddad is coming, and I'm bringing the storm with me." I didn't stay at the empty ranch to mourn. I climbed straight into my truck and drove all the way downtown to the towering glass skyscraper, where Julian and Caroline ran their business. This was their empire, a world of climate-controlled air and software algorithms, where people used fountain pens instead of fists to destroy lives. The lobby security guard tried to step in my path. Seeing an old Texas man in a worn jacket and work boots, he instinctively sensed a threat. He was right. I was a threat, but not the kind he could stop by calling for backup on his radio. I walked straight toward the elevators, my gaze fixed. When he reached out to grab my arm, I gave him a look, the exact look I used to give cocky greenhorns on the oil rigs decades ago. It was a look that told him I'd survived disasters and buried loved ones, and today was absolutely not the day to test my limits. He let go instantly. The elevator shot straight up to the 42nd floor. My ears popped slightly as the city shrank beneath my feet. The young girl at the front desk wearing a headset stammered, trying to tell me that Mr. Pendleton was in a meeting. I told her that I was the meeting. I threw the heavy mahogany doors wide open and strode right into the room. Julian wasn't in a meeting. He was slumped back in his wide leather executive chair, his face buried completely in his hands. Hearing the door slam open violently, he snapped his head up. He looked pale, his eyes bloodshot, like a man who had been trapped in a nightmare for 3 straight days. "Pop!" he hissed in a panicked whisper. "You can't be here. If Caroline sees you—" I didn't let him finish. I marched across the office and slammed my palm down hard on his desk, sending his row of expensive pens rattling across the wood. "They took her, Julian. They marched right into my home and dragged your daughter away like a criminal, and you're sitting right here doing absolutely nothing. You knew about this." Julian flinched. He stood up but refused to look me in the eye, walking over to the window to stare out at the skyline. "I didn't have a choice, Pop." His voice shook. "You don't understand what Caroline is capable of." "Then make me understand," I roared. "Tell me how a grown man lets his wife end the life of his former love and kidnap his own flesh and blood. Tell me exactly what she has on you, Julian, because it must be worth more than your damn soul." Julian turned around, tears streaming down his manicured face. He looked absolutely pathetic. Part of me wanted to shake him, part of me wanted to hit him, and part of me just wanted to hold him. "She has the wire transfers, Pop," he whispered. The room fell dead silent. The low hum of the servers in the corner seemed to grow louder, filling the emptiness between us. "What wire transfers?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Julian collapsed heavily back into his chair. 3 years ago, I made a massive mistake. I got hooked on high-leverage crypto gambling and lost $12 million of the company's money. I thought I could win it back, so I dipped into our clients' retainer funds. I cooked the books. I really believed I just needed a few months to cover the gap. I felt a sickening wave of revulsion wash over me. Embezzlement. My own son had turned into a common thief. And Caroline found out, didn't she? Julian nodded weakly. She caught the financial discrepancy during a premarital audit. She tracked the money trail. She has everything, Pop. Copies of the wire transfers, forged invoices, my digital signatures. She keeps it locked away in a trust fund vault. If I ever try to leave her, if I ever stand up to her, she'll turn it all over to the SEC and the FBI. I'd be looking at 20 years in a federal prison. I'd lose absolutely everything. I looked at him with nothing but pure disgust. You're already in prison, Julian. You built the cell yourself out of your own greed and fear. So you just stood by and let her end Elena's life just to save your own skin. I didn't know she was going to kill her. Julian broke down, sobbing hysterically. I swear to God, Caroline told me she was just paying Elena to leave Texas. She said she would handle it properly. And what about Maya? I pressed hard. Did you even know you had a daughter? Julian wiped his nose with an expensive silk handkerchief. A year ago, Elena sent me a picture. Just one. I wanted to see her, Pop. I really did. But Caroline told me if I ever acknowledged that child, she would ruin me. She said a scandal like that, right on the eve of the biggest IPO in our company's history, would make the investors pull out instantly. I stared right through him. I realized then that the boy I had raised with my own two hands was completely gone. The man sitting across from me in that high-end suit was a total stranger, a weak, profoundly selfish parasite. The door behind me swung open. I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees as the unmistakable scent of expensive perfume filled the air. What a touching family reunion, Caroline said. I turned around slowly. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, pure white pantsuit, holding a blue folder in her hand. The way she walked into the room made it seem like she owned the very air we were breathing. Get out of my sight, Caroline, I said, before I forget my lifelong rule about never laying a hand on a woman. She let out a soft, mocking laugh. Such a fiery temper, Arthur. I finally see where Julian gets his anger from. It's just a shame he didn't inherit any of your backbone. She walked over to the desk and slapped the blue folder down right in front of me with a sharp snap. What's this? I asked. A solution, she replied smoothly. One that works out best for everyone involved. I looked down at the folder but didn't open it, waiting for her to keep talking. You always let the enemy show their hand first. We have a small problem, Arthur, she said, pacing the room like a predator, sizing up its prey. You're making entirely too much noise. You're kicking up dust in a room that needs to stay completely sterile. This morning's intervention by CPS was unfortunate, but it was absolutely necessary. The facts show that you are simply unfit to raise a child. I am 10,000 times more fit than a father who won't even acknowledge his own daughter, and a stepmother who pays to have people eliminated. I shot back. Caroline completely ignored my remark. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the folder. Inside here is a contract. Quite generous, to be completely honest. I listened, keeping my emotions locked down. The terms are simple, she said, counting them off on her fingers. First, you will voluntarily check yourself into the Whispering Pines Care Facility. It is a top-tier home, fully secured with specialized staff. We've already taken care of the payments for your first year. She wanted to lock me away. She wanted to brand me as an unstable old man with dementia, so that no matter what I said down the road, it could be brushed off as the ramblings of a confused mind. Second, she continued, you will sign over a power of attorney, granting Julian control of your ranch. We will handle liquidating it, given the heavy chemical contamination on the property. The proceeds will go toward funding your ongoing care. She wanted to steal my home, the place I bought with 35 years of sweat and blood, the place where Martha took her very last breath. Third, her eyes locked onto mine, completely devoid of warmth. You sign a non-disclosure agreement of the highest level. You acknowledge that you never had a daughter-in-law named Elena, and you agree that the girl named Maya is simply a distant relative you lack the resources to care for. You agree to never speak of our family to the media, the authorities, or anyone else. And if I sign this, I said, my voice incredibly level, what happens to Maya? Caroline smiled, a cold, venomous expression. Maya will be taken care of. We have already contacted a highly exclusive private adoption agency. There is a very wealthy couple in Switzerland who have been desperate for a child. She will have a new name, a new life, and be safely removed from all of this complications. Switzerland. She meant exile, complete erasure. She wanted to send my granddaughter to the other side of the world, so she would never have to look at those gold-flecked amber eyes again. "And if I refuse?" I asked. Caroline stopped pacing and leaned back against the desk, right next to Julian, who was still staring intently at the tips of his shoes. "If you refuse, Arthur, the narrative changes entirely. The ongoing investigation by CPS will uncover clear evidence of mistreatment, not just neglect, but physical harm. We have witnesses lined up and ready to testify under oath that they saw you use a belt on that little girl." "You are lying," I growled, the anger rising in my chest. "Am I?" she asked, tilting her head. "Who do you think the judge is going to believe? A prominent tech philanthropist like myself, or a hostile old man with a documented history of anger issues? You will be arrested. You will spend the rest of your days behind bars. And as for the girl, the state foster system is incredibly crowded, Arthur. Children go missing every single day. She could end up in a juvenile facility. She could end up on the streets, or worse. Who really knows?" She paused, letting the heavy threat hang in the air. "Sign the papers, Arthur. Go spend your remaining years in comfort at the facility, watch some television, and eat your pudding. Let us handle this mess." I looked over at Julian. He was shaking his head slightly, his mouth forming the words, "Please, just do it." He wanted me to sign. He wanted the easy way out. He wanted to bury his sins so he could go right back to being a billionaire. I looked at the contract on the desk, reached out, and picked it up. A flash of victory crossed Caroline's face. She thought she had won. She believed every man had a price, that every man could be broken if you squeezed hard enough. I opened the folder, looking down at the cold legal terminology designed to strip away my freedom, my home, and my honor. Then I looked up right at her. "You really think you hold all the cards, don't you?" I said softly. "You think because you have money and power, you get to play God. But you are nothing but a common bully, Caroline, and bullies always seem to forget one thing." With a sharp, violent motion, I tore the contract right down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet office. The smug smile vanished from Caroline's face instantly. I kept tearing, shredding the documents into tiny pieces until I held nothing but a handful of scrap paper. Then I threw the confetti straight into her face. "I would rather go down fighting than spend a single second groveling to a woman like you." I didn't shout, but my voice vibrated deep from within my chest. "You can take my ranch. You can throw me in a cell. You can spread whatever lies you want to the world. But I will never sign my life away to you. And I will damn sure never let you sell off my granddaughter like she's a piece of damaged cargo." Caroline's face contorted into an expression of absolute, venomous rage. "You foolish old bastard," she hissed. "You just sealed your own fate." "Maybe so," I said, "but at least I'll face it like a real man, which is a hell of a lot more than can be said for him." I pointed a finger at Julian. He flinched away as if I'd struck him across the face. I turned on my heel and marched straight toward the exit. "You have exactly 24 hours, Arthur," Caroline screamed after me. "After tonight, I'm taking off the gloves." I stopped right at the threshold, keeping my back to her. "Don't hold back," I said coldly, "because by the time I am finished uncovering the truth, you are going to need every bit of help you can get to beg the judge for mercy." I walked out of the office, past the terrified receptionist, and stepped into the elevator. My hands were shaking, and my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. I had just declared open war against a woman who could crush me with a single phone call. I had no plan, no backup, only $5,000 in my pocket, and a raging fire in my belly. But as the elevator dropped, an unfamiliar feeling washed over me. I felt incredibly light. For 5 long years I had been going through the motions like a ghost, waiting to fade away. Now I was fully alive. They wanted to play dirty? Fine by me. I know exactly how to handle dirty. Back on the oil rigs, when the unions and the syndicates went to war, I learned exactly how to survive a street fight. I stepped out of the skyscraper and onto the bustling city streets. The sun was still blistering hot, but I felt completely cold. "I need a crew," I muttered to myself. I couldn't do this alone. I thought of the old guys from my oil field days, the ones who hadn't made it to the graveyard yet. Doc, the tech specialist. Big Bear, who handled security. The old disbarred judge who still knew the legal loopholes. And that slick mechanic who used to boost cars before turning straight. We were old, we were tired, but we were far from finished. I pulled out my burner phone. It was time to get the old crew back together. By the time I woke up the next morning, I already had a strategy mapped out. An old hand always has a plan. I had $5,000 in cash, but I knew that against someone with Caroline's resources, that money would burn up fast. I needed my retirement funds, the money I had earned cent by cent, working long, grueling shifts out on the rigs. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to hire a top-tier private investigator to locate exactly where they were holding Maya. I drove down to the old bank on Main Street, the same branch where I'd opened my very first account 40 years ago. I knew the manager, and he knew me, or at least I thought he did. I walked up to the counter, handed my debit card to a young teller I didn't recognize, and requested a full withdrawal of my funds. She tapped away at her keyboard, then suddenly stopped. She frowned, hitting the keys harder, as if extra force would change the numbers on her screen. "Sir," she said without looking up, "there appears to be an issue with your account." "What kind of issue?" I asked. "I checked the balance just yesterday. Everything was fine." She picked up her phone and muttered a few quick words. 2 minutes later, the branch manager, Mr. Henderson, walked over with brisk steps. 3 years back, when he was going through a messy divorce, I had repaired the engine on his pickup truck completely free of charge. He looked at me, but his expression had changed completely. It was guarded, filled with apprehension. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice stiff, "I'm afraid we've been instructed to freeze your assets." "Freeze them?" I raised my voice, the sound echoing through the quiet lobby. "On whose authority?" "Federal mandate," Henderson said, intentionally raising his voice so the folks waiting in line could hear. "We received a flag this morning from the IRS and the FBI. Your account has been flagged as high risk for suspected international laundering and major tax fraud." I let out a loud laugh, the sheer absurdity of it taking over. "Laundering? Henderson, take a good look at me. I drive a 20-year-old truck and buy my clothes at the surplus store. Do I look like an international financier to you?" "This goes way over my head, Art," he said, using my name but leaving out any shred of warmth. "You'll have to contact their fraud division. Until this is cleared up, you can't touch a single dime." He slid my card back across the counter, not handing it to me, but pushing it away as if it were contaminated. I looked around the lobby. Every single eye in the place was fixed on me. A woman clutched her purse tight against her chest. An old man shook his head, sighing. They didn't see a neighbor who had lived in this town for 50 years. They saw a dangerous criminal. Caroline was fast. She hadn't just frozen my life savings. She had managed to pin a federal felony charge right on me overnight. She knew damn well I didn't have the time to fight a long, drawn-out federal investigation. By the time I could ever clear my name, Maya would be halfway to Switzerland, and I'd be rotting 6 feet under. I snatched my card and walked out of the bank. The automatic doors hissed shut behind me, sounding exactly like a sealed vault door locking me out of my own life. I needed a hot cup of black coffee, and I needed to think. I walked 2 blocks over to Sal's Diner. This was my spot. For the last 10 years, every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I'd sit in the corner booth and order a black coffee and 2 eggs, sunny side up. Sal never even had to ask what I wanted. I pushed the door open, and the little bell chimed over the entrance. The diner was bustling, the air thick with the smell of bacon and grease. I started heading toward my usual booth, but then I noticed a plastic sign sitting right on the table. Reserved. I looked over at the counter. Sal was standing there, frantically scrubbing a section of the countertop that was already spotless. The moment he caught sight of me, he looked away. "Hey, Sal!" I called out. "Is the booth taken?" Sal kept his head down, still rubbing the table with a strange, nervous aggression. "Art," he said, keeping his voice dropped low, "you can't eat here today." I froze in my tracks. The clinking of forks and knives in the diner suddenly stopped. "What do you mean?" I asked. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," Sal recited, sounding like he'd rehearsed the line in his head. "Please just leave. We don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" I walked up to the counter. I've been eating here since before you bought this place, Sal. What is this really about? Sal finally looked up, his face completely flushed. It's all over the neighborhood, Art. The flyers and the posts online. What posts? I demanded. Mary, the waitress, walked over with her eyes red. She held up her phone. Look! It was a post shared in the neighborhood watch group. There was a photo of me, my mugshot from 40 years ago when I got arrested during an oilfield labor strike protest. Underneath the photo, in bold red letters, it read, "Warning. Local resident Arthur Pendleton is currently under investigation for severe child endangerment and neglect. Stay away from this individual, highly dangerous." My hands started shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone. Neglect. She had actually done it. She had played the one card that no man could ever truly defend himself against. She had turned me into a monster. I looked right at Sal. You believe this? You know me. You know I would never hurt a child. Sal snatched the phone back. I've got grandkids, Art. I can't take the risk. Even if it isn't true, the rumor alone will ruin my business. Just go. I looked around the diner. These were my neighbors, people I had lent tools to, folks whose lawnmowers I had fixed for free. Now they were looking at me like I was garbage. A mother in the back booth actually reached out and covered her daughter's eyes. A freezing chill spread all the way through my veins. It wasn't from the air conditioning. It was the coldness of being completely cast out by everyone you knew. I walked out of the diner and the bell chimed above me again, only this time it sounded like a funeral bell. Walking down the sidewalk, it felt like I was being marched through a public shaming. I saw 80-year-old Mrs. Gable out watering her flowers, someone whose groceries I used to carry up the steps. The second she saw me coming, she dropped her garden hose, ran inside terrified, and slammed the door shut, clicking the deadbolt into place. That locking sound cut sharp through the morning air. The mailman saw me and immediately crossed the street to take the long way around. I was invisible, yet I was the only thing anyone was looking at. I fled back into my truck and locked the doors. In a world that had suddenly turned hostile, this small metal box was the very last sanctuary I had left. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. It gets lonely at the bottom, doesn't it? Sign the paperwork. I slammed the phone down onto the dashboard. The glass cracked, but the screen stayed lit. I drove back to the ranch, or rather what used to be my ranch. I pulled into the driveway to find someone had thrown rotten eggs at my front door. The yellow yolks were drying against the wood, drawing flies. On the concrete walkway, someone had used chalk to write one word in giant letters, pervert. I stood there staring at the word, the image burning itself right into my eyes. This was what it felt like to be erased. Caroline didn't need to take my life. She just needed to destroy my name. She had stripped away my history, my honor, and my community, leaving me completely exposed in the public square. I went inside and pulled down every single blind. The house was pitch black. I sat in my old leather chair, the material cold against my back. The silence was incredibly heavy. I used to enjoy the quiet, but this was different. This was the dead silence of an exile. I thought about calling Julian, but what was the point? He was probably the one paying for the internet bots to spread those posts. I thought about calling the police over the vandalism, but the police were the ones who took Maya away just last night. They were all on her payroll. I was alone, completely and entirely alone. I looked over at the empty space on the floor where Maya had been playing with blocks just yesterday. If I closed my eyes, I could still hear her screaming as they dragged her down the steps. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to look at this empty house and this ruined reputation, decide the weight was just too heavy, and crawl quietly into that facility to hide away. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the only thing I had left, the digital recorder. I pressed play, letting Caroline's voice fill the empty room. Arrogant, confident, malicious. You are a retired laborer living on a meager pension. Forget all about Elena. I listened to it over and over again. I let her voice echo through the darkness. I took her malice and used it as fuel. She had made a mistake, a massive, fatal, strategic mistake. She had isolated me, cut me off from my neighbors, and stripped away every single thing I cared about. When you take absolutely everything away from a man, you leave him with nothing left to lose. and a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on God's green earth. I stood up, grabbed a bucket of soapy water from the kitchen, and walked outside. I started scrubbing the dried egg off my door with everything I had, working until my knuckles bled. I took the hose and washed the chalk words off the walkway. Mrs. Gable was peeking out from behind her blinds across the street. I saw the curtain move. I didn't look away. I stared right back at her window until she let the curtain drop out of sheer discomfort. "I'm not going anywhere," I muttered to myself. I went back inside and packed a bag. No clothes, just tools. Since I couldn't use the banks, I'd rely on cash. Since the law wouldn't help me, I'd play by the rules of the street. Since my old neighbors were hiding from me, I'd go find new allies. The kind of people who didn't give a damn about a reputation, who only cared about what was right. The kind of people who lived in the shadows where Caroline would never dare to step. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I survived a major blowout on the oil rigs, and I survived the crushing grief of losing my wife. I am going to survive this. By the time I come back, I won't be your neighbor or your friend. I am going to be your reckoning. The place Doc lived in couldn't be found on any tourist map. It was located down in the basement of an abandoned radio repair shop that went bankrupt a decade ago. But somehow the lights down there were always burning. Doc was our communications and medical lead back on the drilling crew. The man could fix a distress radio in the middle of a hurricane using nothing but a piece of gum and a length of copper wire. These days he repaired other things, the kinds of things people were desperate to keep hidden. I walked down the concrete steps, the air thick with the smell of ozone and cheap cigars. I knocked 3 times on the heavy iron door, our old code. The viewer slid open, and a pair of dark eyes behind thick lenses sized me up. "Art," his voice sounded like it had been run over with sandpaper. "You look like you just crawled out of a bad place." "Feels like it too, Doc," I said. "Open up." The heavy iron bolts retracted with a loud metallic thud, and I stepped inside. The room was an absolute labyrinth of tangled cables, blinking monitors, and humming servers. Doc sat in his wheelchair, turning around to face me, a permanent reminder of the day of drilling. Derek collapsed on the rig. "I heard about the little girl," Doc said. "News travels fast on the dark web. They took her." "Yeah," I said, taking a seat on a plastic crate. "They froze my accounts and ruined my name too. But they missed one detail." I pulled Elena's burner phone from my pocket. The screen was shattered and the battery dead, but it was the only weapon I had left. "They forgot to take this." Doc took the phone, turning it over in his grease-stained hands. "A cheap gas station burner. What do you think is on here, Art?" "The truth," I said, "or at least enough of a spark to start a major fire." Doc rolled his chair over to the main console. He plugged the phone into a cluster of cables, his fingers flying across the keyboard at a speed that didn't belong to a man pushing 70. "It's locked down tight," he muttered. "The phone itself is garbage, but the data inside is secured with military-grade AES encryption. Someone put a high-security vault on a $20 piece of plastic. Interesting." "Can you crack it?" I asked. Doc let out a dry laugh. "Is the Pope Catholic? Give me 10 minutes." I sat under the dim lights, watching the lines of data cascade down the screen like a waterfall. I thought about Elena, a girl who had been working 2 jobs at auto shops just to put food on the table. Where would she get the money or the know-how to put that kind of encryption on a phone? She couldn't have. That meant someone had helped her, or the phone had been set up for her before it ever reached her hands. "We're in," Doc said. The monitor flickered, turning bright green as several folders popped up on the screen. I pulled my crate closer. "What's inside?" Doc clicked open a folder labeled simply Tax. Inside there were no standard bank statements. Instead, the screen displayed digital receipts from a cryptocurrency exchange, a long, steady history of monthly wire transfers. "Look at those amounts," Doc said, letting out a low whistle. 10 grand, 10 grand, 20 grand. "Art, this girl was on a regular payroll." "Who was paying her?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. Doc traced the digital footprint across his screens. It was run through a handful of shell companies, a holding firm in Delaware, then shuffled to an offshore account in Panama. But take a look at the original source. It traces right back to a private trust, the Vance Pendleton Joint Trust. Caroline and Julian's joint account. So Caroline hadn't been lying about one thing. She really had been sending money to Elena. But why pay $10,000 to $20,000 every single month just to keep a former flame quiet? It was hush money, plain and simple. But what exactly were they hiding? Check the emails, I said. Doc opened the next folder. Inside were hundreds of messages. They hadn't come from Julian, though. Every single one was from Caroline. I began to read, a cold sweat breaking out across my neck. Funds transferred. Remember the terms. No contact, no photos. If you set foot in Texas, the deal is dead. Added extra this month. Buy something nice for the... Caroline had caught herself, mid-sentence, changing the wording. For the girl, just keep her out of sight. She was managing Elena. She wasn't just paying her off. She was keeping her on a short, invisible leash. And then I saw it. A message from 3 years ago with an attachment. The subject line was just a single word. The complication. Open that one, I said, pointing at the screen. Doc clicked the file. It was a scanned PDF of a legal document. I narrowed my eyes, reading the fine print. It was a divorce petition. The petitioners listed were Julian Pendleton and Elena Reyes. Wait a second, Doc said, turning to look at me. I thought you said they were just dating all those years ago. That's what I believe, too. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. Julian told me they had broken up. He had never mentioned they actually got married. I looked at the bottom of the document. Julian's signature was there, written in a shaky script, but the line for Elena's signature was completely blank, and stamped across the front page in heavy red ink were the words, "Dismissed by court. Incomplete filing." I stared at the screen, the room feeling like it was spinning. They had never divorced. I looked at Doc, who was staring back at me with his mouth wide open. Art, he said softly. If this divorce filing was dismissed, that means on paper they were still legally husband and wife. Yeah, my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. Elena was his wife, his legitimate legal wife. Which means... Doc did the math instantly. It means his marriage to Caroline is a complete sham. It's invalid. It's bigamy. I sank heavily onto the plastic crate. The sheer weight of the realization hit me like a runaway freight train. Julian was a bigamist. In the eyes of the law, he was still married to Elena. When he stood at the altar in that massive Austin estate, surrounded by governors and senators, the entire thing had been a crime. But why go to these lengths? I asked aloud. Why spend millions to bury it? Why not just quietly finalize the divorce? Doc tapped his keyboard again, pulling up a financial news article from 5 years ago. It was about Caroline's father, the tech titan. Vance Group establishes $10 billion family trust with strict moral clauses. Doc read the text aloud. Art, look at this. The trust terms state that if any beneficiary is involved in a major public scandal, including criminal charges or illegal marital arrangements, they are automatically stripped of their inheritance, and the beneficiary's spouse gets absolutely nothing. I finally understood. The puzzle pieces fell into place, explaining the absolute terror in Julian's eyes and the sheer madness driving Caroline. This wasn't just about a reputation. It was about money. Billions of dollars. If the world discovered Julian was a bigamist, Caroline would lose her inheritance. Even worse, with the IPO launching tomorrow, investors were relying entirely on the founder's credibility. A scandal like this would turn their stock into worthless paper overnight. Elena held the key to destroying their entire world. As the legal wife, she could have walked into court at any moment, demanded half of Julian's assets, and utterly ruined Caroline. But she didn't. Why didn't she? I muttered to myself. She had the power to break them. Why live in poverty out in the desert on their handouts? Because of the child, Doc said quietly. I looked over at him. Check the date on the email. Doc pointed to the screen. The message had been sent exactly 1 month after Maya was born. They threatened her, I realized, stunned by the sheer cruelty of the truth. They told her if she ever came back as the legal wife to fight them, they would go after the little girl. So she took the money and accepted the deal. She chose to live in isolation and humiliation just to keep her daughter safe. And now she's gone, I said, because the child is growing up and Caroline couldn't risk a ticking time bomb right before the IPO. Or maybe Elena tried to change the terms. Doc added grimly, they just decided it was cheaper to deal with a widow than to keep paying a wife indefinitely. A single tear rolled down my cheek, and I wiped it away roughly. Elena was a hero. She had sacrificed her dignity, her freedom, and ultimately her life just to protect my granddaughter. And Julian had known the entire time. He knew he wasn't divorced, yet he stood at that altar and lied to the entire world. I stood up, a surge of energy rushing through my limbs, making my hands shake slightly. Print it all, I said. Print every single page. Doc hit the button, and the printer hummed to life, spitting out page after page of warm evidence. This is the silver bullet, Art, Doc said, handing me the thick stack of papers. But you need to be careful. If they're willing to take a life to keep this quiet, what do you think they'll do to you? I folded the documents in half and tucked them deep inside the inner pocket of my jacket, right against my heart. Let them try, I said. They think they're playing a game of chess, that they're the rulers of the board. But I just flipped the table over. I have real leverage now. I'm not just a grandfather begging for custody anymore. I am the father-in-law of the legal wife. By law, my claim to Julian's estate on behalf of Maya is stronger than anything Caroline has. I turned to leave. Art, Doc called out, stopping me at the door. Paperwork isn't going to be enough, he said. Caroline has private security, ex-military types. You're going to need muscle. I know, I replied. That's exactly why my next stop isn't the police station. Where are you going? To find Big Bear. Doc smiled, the blue light from the monitors reflecting off his face. Give the big guy my best. And Art? Yeah? Show them what a real storm looks like. I walked out of the hidden basement and into the alleyway. The sun had completely set, leaving the city in darkness. But for the first time in days, I could see the path forward clearly. I held the truth in my hands. Julian was a criminal, and Caroline was a fraud. And Maya, my little Maya, was the rightful heir to the massive fortune they were trying to steal. I climbed into my truck. The engine coughed a few times before finally roaring to life. I'm coming for you, Caroline, and I won't be bringing a lawyer. I'm bringing the past you tried so hard to bury. The digital files Doc uncovered were a solid roadmap, but I still needed the physical anchor. In a courtroom filled with expensive attorneys, a judge might look at printed copies and dismiss them as fabrications. But a physical document, complete with an official seal and handwritten signatures, is a completely different story. They wouldn't be able to make that disappear so easily. I knew Elena. She was the kind of girl who kept everything. Every birthday card, every movie stub. She held on to it all. There was no way she would have destroyed the one piece of paper proving she was a legal wife, not a mistress. I knew exactly where she would have hidden it. She wouldn't have used a bank safety deposit box, because that required identification and left a paper trail. And she wouldn't have buried it in a yard like a dog with a bone. She would have placed it in the one spot where she had felt truly safe. The place where she and Julian had been genuinely happy, if only for an hour. I drove my truck toward the eastern district of the town, a forgotten corner the city council had long abandoned. The streetlights had been broken since the 90s, and the potholes were deep enough to swallow a tire. I navigated the dark streets entirely from memory. I pulled over a block away from the old Lone Star Motel. The place was completely abandoned now, but 8 years ago it featured a small, run-down wedding chapel. It used to be a sanctuary for eloping couples. I remembered that night perfectly. It had been pouring rain, much like the storm raging in my chest right now. Julian had called me at midnight, begging me to come down. He told me he loved her, that he didn't care about his career or the job offers from major corporations. He just wanted to do what was right. The pastor, who was half-blind and working by candlelight because he hadn't paid his electric bill, had performed the ceremony in secret. I stepped over the shattered glass on the walkway and walked up the steps. The wooden door to the chapel was completely rotted, groaning loudly as I pushed it open. The interior was thick with dust and the scent of mold, with pigeons fluttering up in the rafters. The altar had been smashed to pieces, but the wooden cross on the wall remained. I closed my eyes, and for a second I could almost see them standing there. Elena wore a simple white summer dress, holding wildflowers she'd picked from the side of the road. Julian stood next to her in a thrift store suit, looking at her like she was the only person in the world. Where did that boy go? How did a kid who swore to love her turn into a coward who let her perish in a staged wreck? I walked up to the altar space. The floorboards here were thick oak. I remembered Elena kneeling right here, so nervous her hands were shaking. At one point, she accidentally dropped a small silver pendant her mother had given her right through a gap in the floorboards. Julian had laughed, telling her they'd retrieve it after the service, but they never did. I dropped to one knee, my joints cracking in the absolute silence. I pulled a small crowbar from my jacket, wedged it between the two floorboards where they had knelt, and pried upward. With a sharp, splintering screech, the wood gave way. I shone my flashlight down into the dark opening. Entangled in spider webs, the silver pendant was still there. And right next to it, wrapped inside 3 layers of heavy plastic sealing bags, was an old rusted metal box. I pulled it out, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I wiped the dust from the lid and used the edge of the crowbar to force the rusted lock open. Inside was a stack of photographs, a newborn Maya, and Julian holding the baby. And at the very bottom lay a neatly folded piece of paper. I carefully unfolded it, the paper dry and yellowed with age. Nevada Certificate of Marriage, Clark County. The signatures read, Julian Pendleton and Eleanor Reyes. Witness, Arthur Pendleton. I ran my thumb over my own signature, remembering exactly how it felt to sign that page. I had thought back then that maybe, just maybe, love would be enough to save my son. I had been wrong, but this piece of paper was going to save his daughter. I zipped the document securely into the inner pocket of my jacket. A fierce sense of resolve surged through me. I finally had the absolute smoking gun. I stood up, ready to make my exit, when I caught a sound from outside. It was the distinct crunch of tires moving slowly over the loose gravel driveway. It was deliberate, completely unhurried. I froze. I crept over to the boarded-up window, peering through a narrow gap in the wood. A black SUV had pulled up to the curb, parking directly behind my truck. It was brand new, its polished paint gleaming faintly under the dim light of the street lamp. The windows were as dark as asphalt. The doors opened, and 3 men stepped out into the night. They were heavy-set, wearing tactical pants and black windbreakers. These weren't street thugs. Their movements were clinical, 2 flanking, 1 providing cover. They were mercenaries, Caroline's private security team. She must have planted a tracker on my truck. I cursed my own carelessness. I had been so focused on the destination that I forgot to check my blind spots. They were closing in on the side door. They knew I was inside. I scanned the room. Going out the way I came in meant walking straight into a trap. I bolted toward the sacristy at the back of the chapel, where a small transom window sat high up on the wall. It was tight, but I wasn't the burly man I used to be. Grief and hard labor had worn me down considerably. I stacked 2 broken chairs, climbed up, forced the window open with a hard shove, and squeezed through. I fell heavily onto the slick concrete of the back alley, a sharp pain shooting through my shoulder, but I didn't even have time to groan. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward my truck. The men had already heard the sound of me landing. "He's in the back alley!" someone yelled. I reached the pickup, my palms slick with sweat as I fumbled for the keys. I jammed the key into the ignition and gave it a hard turn. The engine coughed twice. "Come on, old friend," I whispered. Just as the first tracker rounded the corner, the engine roared to life. I saw the man reach inside his jacket. He was pulling a weapon. I slammed the shifter into gear and stomped the gas pedal all the way to the floor. The rear tires spun wildly against the asphalt, letting out a sharp screech before the truck lunged forward. I saw the man raise his weapon, but he didn't fire. They wanted the documents, and they didn't want to leave a body in the middle of a city street, at least not yet. I tore down the road. In the rearview mirror, the black SUV caught up like a rabid dog. Its engine sounded like a jet plane. It was much faster than my old truck, and much heavier. On a straight highway, they would have rammed me off the road in 30 seconds flat. But this wasn't the highway. This was the east side, my territory. I yanked the wheel hard at 9th Street. The left turn was too sharp. The tail of my truck clipped a trash can, sending garbage flying everywhere. The SUV stayed right on my bumper, slamming into a parked car as it took the turn, but it didn't slow down a bit. They were gaining on me. I could see the massive front grille of the SUV looming in my mirror. They were setting up to clip my rear wheel, preparing a PIT maneuver to send me spinning out of control. I had to think like a rig worker. When you're moving heavy equipment on a platform, you don't fight the weight. Neely Yongkong Jen. You force the giant into a corner where it has no room to maneuver. I knew these blocks. I knew that 2 streets over, there was an old, abandoned railroad underpass. The city had tried to repave the road years ago, leaving the clearance incredibly low. My Ford F-150 had factory suspension. It could just barely make it through with maybe 2 inches to spare. But that SUV was a modified Escalade with a lifted chassis and a roof rack. I kept my foot pinned to the floor. The truck hit 60 miles per hour down the narrow residential street, the frame shaking violently. The SUV was practically touching my bumper now. I could clearly see the driver's face behind his sunglasses. I headed straight for the underpass. It looked like a dark hole waiting to swallow us whole. A battered sign hung right above the entrance. Clearance, 6 feet 8 inches. I didn't back off. I gritted my teeth and braced my shoulders, as if that could somehow make the truck smaller. My pickup shot into the tunnel like a bullet. The roof antenna scraped against the concrete ceiling, letting out a horrific metallic shriek and leaving a brilliant trail of sparks behind me. The space was incredibly tight. I could feel the pressure building inside the cab from the displaced air. But I broke through to the other side. By the time the driver of the SUV realized it was a trap, it was far too late. I heard the deafening screech of him slamming on the brakes. Right after that came a massive, shattering crunch. Expensive metal, slammed into immovable reinforced concrete. The roof rack of the SUV caught violently on the edge of the underpass. The sheer momentum caused the entire vehicle to buck wildly, its front wheels lifting off the ground before crashing back down. It was wedged perfectly into the tunnel entrance like a cork pushed too deep into a bottle. I looked in the mirror to see steam hissing from their ruptured radiator. They were completely stuck. I finally let out a long breath I'd been holding in. "Welcome to the East Side, boys," I said coldly. I eased off the gas, ducked down a side alley, and vanished into the labyrinth of the old neighborhood. I was safe for the moment, but my hands were still shaking on the wheel. They knew where I was, and they knew what I drove. I couldn't go back to Doc's place, and I couldn't go back to my ranch. I pulled over under a broken street lamp and thoroughly searched the underside of the truck. Right beneath the passenger side frame, my fingers brushed against the tracker, a small black magnetic disc blinking with a faint red light. I stared at the device. This piece of plastic probably cost more than my entire truck, and they were using it to hunt me down like an animal. Just then, I saw a night shift city bus coming down the opposite street, heading toward the airport. I ran across the road, and right before the doors hissed shut, I slapped the tracker firmly underneath the bus's rear bumper. "Have a nice trip to the airport, fellas," I muttered. Back in the truck, I felt the marriage certificate tucked against my chest. It pressed against my skin, feeling like a hot piece of coal. I had the evidence, and I had the leverage. But the rules of the game had changed completely. They weren't trying to scare me off anymore. They had sent a hit squad. That meant they were panicking. And when people get desperate, they make mistakes. I needed my next move to be a decisive strike. To get Maya back, I had to hit them where it hurt most. I remembered seeing an invitation sitting in the trash can back at Julian's office. Tonight, at the Hyatt Regency downtown, Caroline's company was hosting a massive pre-IPO charity gala and roadshow. Every major player would be there. Investors, media, the governor. It was a black tie event. I looked down at my oil-stained jacket and worn-out boots. I didn't have a tuxedo, but I had something far better. I had the truth. I shifted into gear. "I'm coming for you, Caroline, and I'm bringing a guest you forgot to invite. Justice." Before heading to the gala, though, I had one meeting to keep. I drove out near the abandoned auto shop where I used to teach Julian how to work on cars. It was pitch black, but I instantly spotted the gleam of Julian's Porsche. I had called him from my backup phone, telling him I held the only thing that could save him, and told him to come alone. He climbed out of the car, that high-end suit, looking like nothing more than an ill-fitting costume on him now. It wasn't cold out, but he was trembling. "Pop," his voice shook, "you look like you've been in a war." "I am in a war, Julian," I said, And so are you. The only difference is I know who my enemy is. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the scrapes on my face and the grease on my jacket. Caroline is losing her mind, he whispered. She said you attacked her security team. She said you're incredibly dangerous. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the marriage certificate inside its plastic sleeve. Even in the faint moonlight, it stood out clearly like a beacon. I didn't attack anyone, Julian. I was defending myself, just like Elena tried to defend herself. I held up the page. Do you know what this is? Julian narrowed his eyes, taking a step forward. Then he stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning pale. Where did you get that? He gasped. I found it right where you left it behind, I said, under the floorboards of the old chapel, right next to her little silver necklace. Julian looked down at the ground. I told her to burn it. She swore to me she burned it. She lied to you, I said, because she knew that one day she'd need this to save her daughter from the wolves, and that day is today. I walked right up to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. I felt him flinch slightly under my touch. Julian, this paper proves your marriage to Caroline is a complete fraud. You are a bigamist. In the eyes of the law, Elena was your legal wife until the very moment she passed away. I gave him a firm shake. That means Caroline has no right to control you. It means the equity structure for the launch, tomorrow, has a fatal flaw. It means her father's trust fund won't protect her either. You are free, son. Do you understand? You don't have to be her puppet anymore. We can take this straight to the FBI and prove you were coerced. We can get Maya back. At the sound of Maya's name, Julian broke down completely. He dropped to his knees right on the oil-stained concrete, buried his face in his hands, and began to sob. It was a deep, guttural sound, like a man who had been starved of air for 5 years, finally taking a breath. I'm so sorry, Pop, he wept. I was just so scared. She told me if I fought back, she'd expose the embezzlement. I would have lost everything. I knelt down and pulled him close, feeling like I was holding the little boy who used to cry when his hand got pinched, trying to change a tire. It's okay, Julian, I said gently. We can handle the money part. I'll sell the ranch, and we'll figure out a way to clear the debt together. But you have to make a choice right now. Are you going to be a father, or are you going to stay a terrified puppet? Julian gripped my jacket tight, burying his face into my chest. I want my daughter, he sobbed. I miss Elena so much, Pop. I never stopped loving her. Caroline is a monster. She treats me like a dog. Then stand up, I said. Stand up and come with me. We're going to get Maya right now, and then we go straight to the feds. Julian nodded. He wiped his face with his sleeve and took a deep breath. Okay, Pop, you're right. I'm done with this. He stood up, looking at the marriage certificate in my hand. Can I hold it? He asked softly. Just for a second. I looked at him and saw the pain and regret in his eyes. I handed the paper over. He held it like it was a sacred text, his fingers tracing Elena's signature. I'm going to fix everything, he whispered. I felt a massive weight lift from my chest. I had done it. I had saved my son. The lost boy had finally come home. Give me just a minute, Pop, Julian said, sniffing. I need to compose myself. I can't walk into the FBI looking like a total wreck. Take your time, son, I said. I'll grab a bottle of water for you from the truck. I turned around and started walking back toward my pickup, which was parked in the shadows. I felt exhausted, a deep, bone-weary tiredness, but it was a good kind of tired. I reached the truck and pulled the door open. That's when I caught the sound. The voice traveled clearly through the quiet night air. It was a hushed, hurried, desperate whisper. I froze. Without closing the truck door, I quietly stepped back into the shadows. Julian was standing right under the street lamp. He wasn't looking at the marriage certificate at all. He had his phone pressed tight to his ear, checking his watch. Yeah, Caroline, he whispered. My breath caught in my throat. My blood turned to absolute ice instantly. I've got him secured, Julian said into the phone. He's right here at the abandoned shop. Yeah, I have the original document. It's in my hands. No, Caroline, please, you promised. If I deliver the old man and the paperwork to you, you said you'd wipe my debt clean. You said my options after the launch wouldn't be touched. I leaned my head against the cold metal of the truck frame and closed my eyes. The pain of that moment was sharper than the time a snapping steel cable hit me on the oil rig. It was the pain of watching hope die completely. My son hadn't been crying out of regret. He was crying because he was weak. He was crying because he knew he was about to sell out his own father just to save his money and his comfortable life. "How much longer?" Julian asked. 5 minutes? Okay, I'll keep talking to him. Just please tell the security team not to rough me up when they make their move. I opened my eyes and took one last look at him. He stood there under the street lamp, adjusting his tie and practicing his sorrowful expression, waiting for me to return with a bottle of water so he could deliver me straight to the wolves. He wasn't Julian anymore. Julian had died a long time ago. This shell of a person in an expensive suit was filled with nothing but fear and greed. It became perfectly clear to me right then. I was completely on my own. There was no family reunion, and there was no redemption. There was only the mission, and the mission was to rescue Maya. I looked at the marriage certificate in his hands. I had lost the physical original, but he had forgotten exactly who he was dealing with. I'm no lawyer. I'm a mechanic who spent his entire life working on heavy engineering. I always keep a backup. Before coming out to meet him, I had used the specialized equipment at Doc's place to scan that marriage certificate into a high-definition digital file. It might not hold the same weight as the original in a formal courtroom, but as a media bomb, it was more than enough. And besides, I still had this. I felt the digital recorder in my jacket pocket. It had been running the entire time. I had his full confession on tape, his admission of embezzlement, and his confirmation of conspiring with Caroline. I looked out at the empty lot. I could have easily walked over and broken his neck like a dry twig. It would have been simple, but that would have been a mercy, and he didn't deserve mercy. He deserved to live with the weight of exactly what he had done. I quietly closed the truck door. I didn't turn the key. I released the emergency brake, shifted the transmission into neutral, and used every bit of strength in my body to push the truck backward until it rolled into the shadows of a neighboring alley. Only after I had coasted 2 blocks away did I finally start the engine. In the rearview mirror, I watched the abandoned auto shop in the distance light up with the piercing white beams of multiple xenon headlights. 3 black SUVs completely surrounded the area. I saw armed personnel leap from the vehicles, and I saw Julian pointing frantically toward the space where my truck had just been parked. I watched Caroline step out of the lead vehicle and strike Julian across the face with a vicious slap. "Goodbye, Julian," I said softly. I didn't feel any grief anymore. I felt nothing but a cold, singular focus. I had shed the title of a father. Now I was purely a soldier. I checked the time. There were exactly 2 hours left before the pre-IPO charity gala began. They thought they had trapped me at the auto shop, and they thought they could rest easy now that they held the physical paperwork. Tonight, they would be raising glasses of champagne at the venue, laughing at the old man they thought they had played like a fiddle. But they had no idea that the old man was still attending the event, and I was bringing destruction with me. I drove straight toward the neon lights of the downtown skyline. To pull off the next phase of the plan, I had to take a major risk and slip back onto my ranch under the cover of darkness. I knew it was dangerous to expose myself, but if I was going underground, I needed supplies. My blood pressure medication, the cash hidden inside the bathroom ventilation duct, and a photograph of Martha, one we had taken at a county fair years ago, with funnel cake powdered sugar still dusted on the tip of her nose. If I was destined to go down in this fight, I wanted to see that face one last time. I parked the truck 2 blocks away and slipped through the neighbors' backyards to get to the house. The area was terrifyingly quiet, a heavy, suffocating silence. I pushed the back door open and stepped into the kitchen. The familiar scent of the house hit me instantly. Old motor oil, leather, and the faint tobacco smell from before I quit smoking. It was the scent of a full life. I didn't turn on any lights. I knew the placement of every single floorboard with my eyes closed. I grabbed the cash, took the medication, walked into the bedroom, and picked up the silver frame from the nightstand. "I'm sorry, Martha," I whispered into the dark. "I'm sorry I brought this darkness back to our home." I turned to make my exit, but as I reached the kitchen, I caught a sharp sound. It wasn't a knock, and it wasn't a footstep. It was the distinct sound of glass shattering violently. Right after that came a heavy, rushing whoosh, like a massive exhaust fan kicking on, followed by a deafening roar of fire. They hadn't just broken a window, they had thrown incendiary devices straight into the house. The pungent chemical smell of gasoline and accelerant filled the air instantly. A wall of intense heat rolled over me. The fires spread with terrifying speed. They must have doused the porch in fluid before throwing the bottles. "Fire!" I shouted instinctively, though there wasn't a soul around to hear me. I tried to sprint for the back door, but right then, another bottle crashed through the kitchen window, exploding violently right by the sink. Liquid flames splattered everywhere, igniting the old wooden cabinets in a split second. My exit was cut off completely, a solid wall of fire standing between me and the yard. Thick black smoke began to collect near the ceiling, stinging my eyes and choking my lungs. I immediately dropped flat onto my stomach. The military teaches you that the air closest to the floor is always the cleanest. The front door was out of the question, and the back door was blocked. My only option was the basement. I kicked the cellar door wide open and scrambled down the wooden stairs. I coughed heavily against the black dust. The air in the basement was slightly cooler, but the smoke was already pouring down through the gaps in the floorboards above. I crawled toward the small awning window used for ventilation. It was positioned high up on the wall and had been painted shut for years. I grabbed a heavy framing hammer from the workbench and swung it with everything I had against the glass. The pane shattered with a loud crash. I used my sleeve to clear away the jagged shards, gripped the frame with both hands, and forced my old frame through the narrow opening, ignoring the sharp pain in my shoulder. I tumbled out onto the grass of the side yard, coughing violently, and immediately rolled away from the building until I hit the wooden perimeter fence. Using the fence for support, I stood up and looked back at my home. It was completely gone. The flames soared 20 feet into the night sky. The roof was already beginning to collapse inward, and the windows were bursting one by one from the intense heat, sending a shower of brilliant sparks into the dark like a twisted firework display. Covered from head to toe in black soot, I pressed Martha's photograph tight against my chest. Watching the front porch where I had once taught Julian to tie his shoes collapse entirely into the inferno. My entire past was burning right before my eyes. The distant wail of sirens began to echo in the night, but it was far too late. This was a professional job, designed to leave absolutely nothing behind. My neighbors were standing out on their lawns in their pajamas. They stared at the fire in shock, but not a single one of them looked my way. The light from the flames illuminated their faces, and I saw a deep, unadulterated fear in their eyes. A house doesn't go up like this by accident. It was a clear message to the entire town. Anyone who stands with Arthur Pendleton will burn right alongside him. The burner phone in my pocket vibrated. I pulled out the shattered device to find a text message. "Next time you won't be waking up to run. Get out of the state." I looked down at the phone, then looked back at the roaring fire. Most folks would have been completely broken by this moment, dropped to their knees weeping over everything they had lost. But as the roof finally came down with a thunderous roar, a strange transformation took place inside me. My fear completely evaporated. For days I had been carrying fear. Fear of losing my property. Fear of losing my reputation. Fear of prison. Fear of death. But now the absolute worst had already happened. They had taken my home, ruined my name, and tried to take my life. Yet here I was, still standing. A cold, absolute calm washed over me. It was a familiar feeling, the exact sensation I had 30 years ago during a catastrophic blowout on a drilling rig. When you realize there is no retreat left, the only thing left to do is cut a path straight forward. The Arthur who worried about his retirement funds and his pension died right there in that fire. The man standing in the shadows of that yard was an entirely different creature. I had been stripped completely bare. I had no property, no address, and absolutely nothing left for them to hold over my head. A man with nothing left to lose is completely invincible. I looked down at the text message. "There won't be a next time, Caroline," I muttered under my breath, "because I'm done playing defense. You burned my past? Fine by me. That weight was only slowing me down anyway. Now I am light as a feather. Now I am a ghost." I didn't wait for the fire trucks, and I didn't wait for the police to take a statement. that would only end up lost or altered. I turned my back on the flames and walked straight into the darkness of the back alley. My stride was steady. The pain completely vanished. Adrenaline and pure, unfiltered resolve are the best fuels on earth. I needed weapons, not firearms. Guns are too loud, too clumsy for what comes next. I needed tools, I needed access, and I needed a crew. Caroline wanted a war. She thought she was dropping bombs on a defenseless old countryman. She didn't realize she had just blasted open the cage holding a predator. I passed a dark shop window and caught my reflection in the glass. My face was covered in soot, my hair singed, and my eyes burned incredibly bright against the darkness of my skin. I didn't look like a gentle grandfather. I looked like a reckoning. Good, tomorrow the hunt begins. The place was called The Terminal, a gritty, worn-down bar operating out of the basement of an old veterans' hall on the edge of the industrial district. There was no sign outside. Only folks who had served or lived on the fringes knew it existed. Inside, the air was a thick mix of stale beer, sawdust, and the cheap cologne old men used to mask their isolation. But to me, this place was a sanctuary. I walked down the concrete steps, my heavy work boots making a sharp, metallic sound against the safety treads. I still carried the scent of the fire on me, my jacket half singed, looking like a man who had marched straight out of an inferno. The one-armed bartender took a single look at me, asked absolutely nothing, and reached beneath the counter to pull out a bottle of cheap whiskey in a clean glass. I walked straight toward the furthest booth hidden deep in the shadows. Doc had already put out the call. He said they would be here, and Doc never missed a mark. 3 older men sat in the booth. To an outsider, they looked like nothing more than remnants left behind by time, but I knew that beneath the gray hair and the wrinkles lay the sharpest minds and the hardest fists I had ever encountered in my life. First was the judge. He wore a suit that was 20 years out of style, but pressed perfectly sharp. He used to be the finest defense attorney in the state, capable of turning any case on its head. But he possessed a fatal flaw, a conscience. 10 years back, he exposed a magistrate taking kickbacks from private prison syndicates. The system didn't reward him, it disbarred him, took his livelihood, and left him driving a cab just to get by. A glass of plain water sat in front of him. He always said he needed to keep his mind perfectly clear in case the fight came knocking. Next was Slick Larry. He was a small, wire-thin man, filled with a nervous energy that kept his leg constantly shaking. His fingers were stiff with arthritis, but give the man a paperclip and 10 seconds, and he could bypass the security on a vault. He had spent 5 years in a federal facility for breaching a major bank server, not for the money, but simply to prove he was capable of it. Right now, he was meticulously aligning the salt and pepper shakers on the table into a flawless line. Finally, there was Big Bear. He took up more than half the space in the booth, an indigenous man standing 6'6", built like a literal bulldozer. He used to handle security and collections on the east side, making a living by enforcing the rules of the street. He had stepped away from that life years ago, not raising a fist in 15 years, but everyone knew the giant was simply sleeping. He was peeling peanuts, his massive fingers crushing the shells to dust with a gentle squeeze. The moment I stepped up, all 3 looked up. "Art?" The judge's voice was deep and resonant. "You look like you just crawled out of a chimney." "Close enough," I said, sliding into the open space. "My ranch is gone. They leveled it with incendiary devices." The table went completely quiet. Larry stopped adjusting the shakers. Big Bear stopped chewing. "Leveled it?" Big Bear's voice sounded like 2 boulders grinding together. "Were you inside?" I nodded. "They wanted me gone. They took my granddaughter, and Julian was the one who set me up. I poured a shot of whiskey, but I didn't drink it. I dipped a finger into the liquor and pressed it against a fresh cut on my cheek. The sharp sting kept my mind completely focused. I laid out the entire story for them. Elena's passing, the undissolved marriage, Caroline's multi-billion-dollar trust fund, and Maya being held in a private youth facility under the guise of an evaluation. When I finished, the judge leaned back, crossing his hands. "Let me summarize. You're going up against the daughter of a tech titan, a handful of compromised local deputies, and a legal team backed by billions of dollars. And you have no money, no property, and a federal flag on your name for suspected financial fraud. That sums it up perfectly, I said. What do you need us to do? The judge asked. I looked around the table at them. I can't pay you. I only have $5,000 in cash to my name. But I can give you something else. What's that? Larry asked, his eyes darting back and forth. An opportunity, I said. An opportunity to prove those people wrong. The ones who think they can just toss folks like us aside like garbage. Look at us. The world thinks we're useless, just a bunch of old-timers waiting for the graveyard. But I checked the schedule. Tonight, at the Austin Convention Center, Caroline's company is throwing their massive pre-IPO roadshow party. It's being broadcast live. The mayor, the big investors, everyone is going to be there. You can't just walk in there, Art, the judge said, shaking his head. For an event of that scale, security is going to be incredibly tight. You won't even get near the entrance before they lock you up as a security threat. And even if you manage to slip inside, a court of law isn't going to look at your evidence on the spot. I don't need a judge, I replied. I just need an audience. I pulled out the flash drive containing the digital backup of all the evidence. I'm not looking to file a lawsuit, Judge. I'm going to unmask them right in front of everyone. The only thing Caroline truly cares about is her public image and the stock price tomorrow morning. If we can show the entire live audience that she's married to a bigamist and tied to a cover-up, the money will vanish in an instant. Her power will completely crumble. The judge nodded slowly, a spark of interest in his eyes. The court of public opinion, the one place where billions of dollars can't buy an absolute verdict. I like it. But getting inside is damn near impossible. Larry rubbed his hands together, letting out a sharp cackle. The Austin Convention Center runs its security network on Honeywell's newest central hub. But I happen to know a back-end vulnerability in their logistics system. I can get us through the door. What about the muscle? Big Bear asked, his voice low and heavy. She's bound to have those private security types with her, the ones who leveled your place. I looked directly at Big Bear. That's exactly why I need you, Bear. I need someone to watch my back and make sure I can reach that microphone. Big Bear looked down at his massive hands. I made a promise to the preacher years ago, Art. I said I wouldn't raise a hand against anyone else. I'm not asking you to hurt anybody, I said. I'm asking you to protect a 5-year-old girl. They're trying to pack her up like a piece of freight and ship her out of the country. Big Bear closed his eyes, taking a long, deep breath. When he opened them, the old fire from his days on the streets, decades ago, was burning bright. For the little girl, I'm in. The judge picked up his water glass. I can draw up a few legal declarations to back you up. And if we're playing the media, we need to control the narrative. I still have a few contacts left from my old days. Independent journalists who love nothing more than taking a shot at the elite. I'll make sure that when you step up to that stage, every single lens in the room is fixed on you. I looked at my crew, a disbarred attorney, a wire-thin thief, a retired enforcer, and me, a homeless mechanic. But looking at them, I knew we were an absolute army. Caroline's mercenaries were fighting for a paycheck, but my brothers were fighting for honor. We have exactly 4 hours, I said, checking the clock on the wall. We need clothes, we need gear, and we need to move fast. Larry stood up. I know a guy who handles stage props downtown. He owes me a favor. We can secure high-end formal wear. Big Bear stood up next. I need to retrieve a few things from the trunk of my car, specialized tools for peaceful crowd dispersal. The judge straightened his collar. I'll handle the transport. My cab is parked right outside. It's the one vehicle they'll never expect. I knocked back the shot of whiskey. The burn felt absolutely incredible. 4 old-timers stepped out into the night air. The wind was freezing cold, but I felt completely on fire. Caroline thought the flames would turn me to ash, but she forgot that fire is exactly what tempers iron into solid steel. Tonight, she was going to feel the full weight of that steel. The address Ms. Sterling had entered into the official report was listed as a local youth counseling facility out in the suburbs. But Doc had bypassed their system completely, discovering it was nothing but a front. Maya was actually being held at a highly secured private facility called Peaceful Shores. The name was a twisted joke. The place sat right on the edge of a desolate industrial park, looking like a concrete fortress surrounded by a 12-foot wall topped with live electrical wire. It didn't look like a place for children. It looked like a black site meant to hide away the complications that wealthy people wanted to vanish. The judge parked his yellow Ford Crown Victoria cab in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse 2 blocks away, keeping the engine running. A heavy rain was pounding relentlessly against the roof. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I wore a slightly ill-fitting tuxedo that smelled faintly of mothballs. Next to me, Big Bear looked like a mountain wrapped in black fabric. In the passenger seat, Larry was nervously sorting through his collection of lockpicks. "We look like a retirement home choir that took a wrong turn," I muttered. "We look like a massive amount of trouble," the judge corrected me. "I'm giving you exactly 15 minutes. If you aren't out by then, I'm driving this cab straight through their front entrance to create a diversion." "Keep your eyes on the watch, Judge," I said. We pushed the doors open and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The chill cut straight through my clothes. We slipped toward the delivery entrance at the rear of the building. Larry had reviewed the blueprints. There was a digital keypad locking the door. Right above us, the red indicator light of a security camera blinked in the darkness. "Smile for the lens, Bear," I whispered. Big Bear reached up with his massive hand. He didn't smash the device. Instead, he took a large piece of chewing gum he'd been working on for 10 minutes and slapped it perfectly over the lens. Simple, quiet, and completely effective. Larry stepped up to the keypad. He pulled out a small device that looked like a garage door opener, attached to a bundle of wires, and pressed it against the housing. The digits on the screen began to cycle wildly. "Move it, Larry," Big Bear urged in a low rumble. "My suit is going to shrink." "Never rush a craftsman," Larry grinned. Click. The indicator light turned bright green, and the heavy metal door popped open. We slipped inside. The hallway smelled of heavy bleach and cheap institutional food, the exact scent of a lockdown facility. The lighting was dim. My boots made a faint squeak against the linoleum, but Big Bear moved with the absolute silence of a cat despite his size. We needed to find room 104. That was the intake assignment Doc had uncovered in the logs. We rounded a corner and froze. A guard sat at the end of the hall, completely distracted by his phone. He looked up, catching sight of 3 soaked old men in formal wear, appearing out of nowhere in a high-security corridor. He looked like he thought he was seeing things. "Hey!" he yelled, scrambling to his feet and reaching for the baton at his belt. "You can't be back here!" Big Bear stepped forward. He didn't run. He just moved forward like a slow, deliberate glacier. The guard drew his baton. "Back off, old man, or I'll—" Big Bear reached out, his open palm the size of a baseball mitt, and caught the descending baton mid-swing. He didn't pull it away, he just squeezed. The sound of heavy plastic and metal fracturing under his grip cut sharp through the air. The guard's eyes went wide. He looked down at the ruined baton, then up at Big Bear's face. "Time for a rest, son," Big Bear said, his voice as gentle as a lullaby. He placed his other hand flat against the guard's shoulder, his thumb pressing firmly into a specific nerve bundle near the neck, an old enforcement technique from the 70s. The guard's eyes rolled back, and his knees buckled completely. Big Bear caught him before he hit the floor, leaning him quietly against the wall. "Just took the wrong job," Big Bear said, straightening his bow tie. We kept moving. Room 100, 102, 104. The door was a heavy, reinforced metal fire door with a small window of tempered glass. It was locked from the outside. Larry didn't bother with electronics this time. He pulled out 2 thin metal tension tools and slipped them into the keyway. 2 seconds later, it clicked open. I pushed the door wide. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint glow of a street lamp through the window. It was freezing inside, far too cold for a child. A small metal cot sat in the corner, covered by a thin gray blanket, but the bed was completely empty. My heart stopped instantly. "She isn't here," I whispered, panic rising in my throat. Had they moved her already? Had they put her on a plane out of the country? "Check the restroom," Larry said. It was completely vacant. Then I remembered the Airstream trailer in the desert, the way she had hidden herself in that tiny closet space. It was her survival instinct when fear took over. I looked around the room. There was no closet, only a heavy metal locker bolted securely to the wall. I walked over and knocked softly against the sheet metal. "Maya?" I whispered as quietly as I could. "It's Granddad." Absolute silence. "Maya, please. I know you're scared, sweetheart. I came to take you home." I caught the faint rustle of fabric inside. I gripped the handle and pulled. It wasn't locked. The door swung open. Right at the bottom of the locker, curled tightly among a pile of unwashed linens, was my granddaughter. She was still wearing those dinosaur pajamas, completely covered in dust and grime. She held her knees tight to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She looked up, taking in the tuxedo, the blistering marks on my face from the fire, and my wet hair plastered to my forehead. "Granddad?" she whispered timidly. I dropped straight to my knees on the cold floor, completely ignoring the ache in my joints. I reached out and pulled her tight into my arms. She was so small, so incredibly fragile, and she gripped my neck like a lifeline. "I thought you weren't coming," she sobbed into my shoulder. "The lady told me you were gone. She said you didn't want me anymore." "That woman is a liar, Maya," I said, my voice choking up as tears mixed with the rainwater on my face. "I told you. Granddad always keeps his promises." I stood up, lifting her onto my hip. She wrapped herself around me like a cub, refusing to let go. "We need to move, Art," Big Bear said from the doorway, checking his watch. "The guard shift changes in 4 minutes." I looked at my brothers. Larry gave a tight, nervous smile, and Big Bear gave me a solid thumbs up. "Let's get out of this place," I said. We hurried back down the corridor, passing the guard who was just beginning to stir against the wall, and burst through the exit into the downpour. We sprinted across the lot toward the waiting cab. The judge had already thrown the rear door wide open before we even reached the curb. We piled inside, Big Bear in the front, with me, Larry, and Maya crowding the back seat. "Go, Judge, go!" I yelled. The tires spun wildly against the flooded asphalt before the cab launched forward into the night. Right behind us, the lights of the facility flared bright, as a loud alarm began to wail through the storm. But we had already broken clear of the perimeter. Maya held on to me with everything she had. I took off my damp tuxedo jacket and wrapped it tight around her frame to keep her warm. "Are we going home, Granddad?" she asked, looking up at me with those gold-flecked amber eyes. Julian's eyes, but with Elena's soul behind them. "Not just yet, Maya," I said, smoothing her damp hair back. "We have one last stop to make." "Where?" "To a party," I told her. "A very exclusive party. We're going to tell everyone a story." I caught the judge's eyes in the rearview mirror. "The cargo is secure?" he asked. "Safe and sound," I replied. "How long until we reach the convention center?" 10 minutes if I drive like I did when I was ducking East Side syndicates back in the day," the judge said. 20 if I play it normal." "Be a madman, Judge," I replied. "The bride is waiting." The cab cut wildly through the downpour, weaving around cars like a stray bullet. I looked down at my chest. Maya had finally drifted off to sleep, worn down by sheer exhaustion and the new feeling of safety. "Rest up, little flower," I whispered. "Things are going to look a lot different when you wake up." I checked my pocket. The waterproof sleeve with the flash drive was exactly where I left it. I caught my reflection in the window. I had managed to wipe the soot away, but the fresh cuts remained. I looked old, tired, and thoroughly battered, but I was incredibly dangerous. Caroline wanted to use family as a pawn in her game. She wanted to tear lives apart for money. Tonight, I was going to show her what a real family looked like. It wasn't a pristine portrait hanging in a gated mansion. It was 3 old-timers in mothballed suits, driving a beat-up yellow cab through a rainstorm to save a little girl. "We're coming for you, Caroline, and we're bringing the storm." The Austin Convention Center looked like a shimmering fortress of neon and steel under the night sky. From the back seat of the cab, I could see a long line of black town cars creeping toward the entrance like a swarm of shiny beetles drawn to sugar. These were the elite controlling the city: tech moguls, venture capitalists, and politicians. They were gathering to celebrate Caroline's multi-billion-dollar launch. The banner above the entrance read, "Connecting Futures, Reshaping Families." The irony tasted like bitter iron in my mouth. She was preparing to stand on a stage and lecture the world on using technology to strengthen human connections, all while attempting to erase my granddaughter from existence. The judge killed the headlights as he pulled the cab into the shadows of the underground loading area. The rain had cleared, leaving the asphalt slick and pitch black. "We have a situation," the judge said, eyeing the platform. "Two private guards, not venue staff, tactical gear." I leaned forward. They wore the same black windbreakers as the men who had tracked me down at the chapel. Caroline wasn't taking any chances. She had locked down the perimeter. "Larry, can you bypass them?" I asked. Larry narrowed his eyes. "Not without making noise. And the second we stir things up, they'll trigger a complete lockdown inside before we even reach the floor." I looked over at Big Bear. He remained in the passenger seat, his massive frame completely shielding Maya. She had just woken up, her wide amber eyes staring fearfully at the flashing exterior lights. "Bear," I said, "I need you to stay with the vehicle. Keep the engine running and protect them. If things go sideways inside, if I'm not back out in 20 minutes, you take her straight across the state line. Go to your sister's place in Houston and don't stop." Big Bear turned around, a heavy worry etched deep into his features. "You shouldn't go in there alone, Art. The place is crawling with sharks." "I'm not alone," I said, tapping the pocket containing the flash drive. "I've got the truth, and I've got the judge." The judge adjusted his bow tie in the mirror. "My credentials might be expired, Art, but I still know how to make an entrance. I know half the journalists on that floor." I turned to Maya, taking her tiny hand in mine. "Maya, Granddad has to handle a piece of business. Uncle Bear is going to stay right here with you. He's the strongest man in the world, and you are completely safe with him." "Are you coming back?" she whispered softly. I squeezed her hand gently. "I always come back." The judge and I stepped out of the cab, adjusting our creased, mothball-scented tuxedos. In the dim light of the alley, we looked just enough like distracted service staff to pass by unnoticed. But we weren't here to serve drinks. We bypassed the main loading dock and headed toward the employee smoking area, where a heavy fire door was propped open with a stray brick. A young kitchen hand was leaning against the wall, completely absorbed in his phone. He looked up, catching sight of two old men in formal wear, likely assuming we were lost guests searching for a restroom. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, flicking his ashes onto the concrete. "Main entrance is around the front." "We know," I said, walking right past him with absolute certainty, just stepping out for a breath of fresh air before the main event reaches its climax. He stepped aside without a second thought. It was an old trick I learned back in the service. If you act like you belong, most folks won't ever question your presence, even if you're marching straight into the fire. We moved through the massive kitchen area. It was absolute chaos. Chefs shouting, pans clattering, steam rising thick into the air. Nobody gave us a second look. We were just obstacles in the way of servers rushing out plates of steak and lobster. When we pushed through the double doors at the far end, the atmosphere shifted instantly. We stepped from the sweltering heat of the kitchen into a massive, heavily air-conditioned hall, filled with the low thrum of electronic music. There had to be over 1,000 people in the room. Brilliant laser lights cut through the air, and a massive circular LED screen displayed a floating holographic logo of the company. We stood in the shadows at the very back of the hall. I pulled out my burner phone. The clock read 8:55 p.m. According to the program, Caroline's personal keynote address was scheduled for exactly 9 p.m. I opened the email application Doc had configured for me back at the shop. The subject line read, "Caroline Vance, definitive evidence of cover-up, bigamy, and fraud." The attachments included the high-definition audio recording of her threats, screenshots of the offshore accounts funding Elena, the dismissed divorce documents, and Elena's final video message from the desert. The recipient list was extensive: the NASDAQ Regulatory Committee, the SEC CNN, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and the local field office of the FBI. I looked over at the judge. "Ready?" The judge pulled out his own phone. He had already sent a text to a senior independent reporter on the floor, ensuring that whatever happened next, the cameras wouldn't stop rolling. "The timer is set," I said. The message was scheduled to broadcast automatically at exactly 9:05 p.m., right when her speech would be hitting its stride, focusing on ethics and vision. It was a digital explosive designed to tear down the empire she built on lies. "Let's move," I said, tucking the phone away. We walked along the perimeter aisle toward the front. The judge stayed back slightly, ready to manage the press. Caroline stepped up to the glass podium, looking radiant under the spotlight. She wore a minimalist silver-gray gown that gleamed under the lights. She looked as flawless and detached as a software model, completely devoid of human warmth. This was what malice looked like in the modern world. No sharp edges, just corporate backing and Wall Street endorsements. She tapped the microphone, and the entire room fell silent. "Good evening, everyone," Caroline's voice flowed like warm silk through the audio system. "Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we aren't just celebrating a technological breakthrough. We are celebrating a commitment to the values that hold our communities together." The room erupted into applause. The red indicator light on the camera the judge had flagged flared to life, broadcasting live to the world. Caroline continued. "Technology is meant to bring us closer. Growing up, my father always taught me that with great capability comes great responsibility. That is why our venture isn't merely focused on returns. We are dedicated to protecting the vulnerable, the forgotten, and the children who need our support most." A cold rage settled into my chest. She was lecturing a crowd on protecting children while keeping my granddaughter locked away in a concrete cell. She spoke of responsibility while covering up the loss of a mother's life. I checked the time. 9:02 p.m. 3 minutes left. I quickened my pace, stepping out from the side aisle and directly into the edge of the spotlights. I was 20 feet from the stage. A heavy-set security guard with an earpiece spotted me, muttered something into his collar, and started moving quickly in my direction. I kept my eyes locked on Caroline, refusing to slow down. She saw me. It was an incredibly subtle shift, but I caught it. Her perfect delivery faltered for a fraction of a second. Her gaze cut across the VIP rows, landing squarely on a battered old Texas man in a cheap tuxedo. Her smile remained intact, but her pupils dilated with instant recognition. She gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod to the side. It was the signal for her team to remove me. The guard reached me, gripping my arm tightly. "Sir, you can't be in this area," he growled. I didn't try to struggle against his grip. I didn't need to reach the microphone. I just needed to ensure everyone was watching. I yanked my arm free with a sharp jerk and used every bit of lung capacity I had left to shout over the noise. "Ask her where Maya is." My voice, coarse from the smoke of the fire, cut sharp through the sterile silence of the convention hall. Caroline froze at the podium. "Ask her about the little girl she took. Ask her about the mother who lost her life," I roared. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by a sudden wave of muttering. "Remove him from the floor," Caroline said into the microphone, her voice dropping, forgetting to cover the receiver. 2 more guards rushed forward, grabbing my shoulders forcefully and starting to drag me toward the exit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caroline attempted to recover, forcing a tight smile back onto her face. "Please remain seated. Just a disturbed intruder. In our line of work, we recognize the deep need for better mental health support in our cities." 9:05 p.m. Chime, chime, chime. It started as a few scattered alerts in the front rows. Within seconds, it built into a chorus of vibrations and tones echoing through the entire hall. Hundreds of devices were alerting simultaneously. The reporters up front stared down at their screens. The investors pulled out their devices. Sitting in the center of the VIP section, Caroline's father, the tech titan himself, retrieved his phone. The face of the reporter the judge had contacted changed instantly. He stared at the attachments on his screen, then looked up at Caroline in absolute shock. He motioned wildly to his camera operator. The lens immediately panned away from the stage, tracking right back to where the guards were holding me. "What is the meaning of this?" Caroline's composure cracked completely. She looked out toward Julian in the front row. Julian was staring at his device, his face completely drained of color. Caroline's father stood up abruptly, his frame shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. He was a ruthless businessman, and looking at the documentation and audio files on his screen, he recognized the ruins staring them down. He looked toward his daughter, his expression shifting from confusion to absolute fury. "Let him go!" the older man roared, his voice booming over the sound system. The security guards froze, looking between Caroline and the man who actually funded their paychecks. They slowly backed away, releasing their grip on my shoulders. I stood in the center of the aisle, adjusting the collar of my tuxedo. I didn't need a microphone anymore. The entire hall had gone so quiet you could hear a pin drop against the carpet. "Caroline," I said, my voice steady and clear in the silence, "you were just speaking about family and truth. Why don't we show the audience a real piece of history?" The judge had already coordinated with a sympathetic contact in the production booth. The massive circular LED screen above the stage went dark for a single second, the corporate logo vanishing entirely. Then Elena's face appeared, spanning 3 stories high above the crowd. She was weeping, her expression filled with pure desperation. "He has Julian's eyes!" Elena's trembling voice echoed flawlessly through the high-end sound system, reaching every corner of the hall. "That woman threatened to take him away forever." In the front row, a woman dropped her champagne glass, the sound of breaking glass shattering the silence of the room. Caroline remained frozen on the stage. Her silver gown no longer looked like armor. It looked like a fragile shell. She stared out at the sea of faces looking back at her with shock, disgust, and judgment. And finally, her eyes turned to me. For the first time in 5 years, I caught a glimpse of real, genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't the panic of losing a fortune. It was the look of a predator, backed into a corner, realizing the trap had just clamped down tight around its throat. "Happy birthday, Caroline," I mouthed to her across the space. The trap was sprung. This wasn't just a PR nightmare anymore. The SEC and the FBI were already on their way. I looked over at Julian. He remained paralyzed in his seat, completely frozen. He caught my eye and gave a faint, defeated nod. He knew it was over, but a cornered animal doesn't go down without a fight. Caroline wasn't finished yet. With a sudden, sharp motion, she reached deep inside the evening bag resting beneath the podium. I caught the glint of metal. "Weapon!" I yelled at the top of my lungs, diving behind a nearby round table. Absolute chaos erupted instantly. The convention hall transformed into a panicked sea of black tuxedos and evening gowns. The expensive scent of perfume and high-end catering was replaced in a split second by the sharp odor of panic and sweat. I stayed low against the thick carpet. Amid the screams and the frantic pushing of hundreds of people, 2 venue guards stepped in front of me. Unlike Caroline's private security team, these were just regular hotel staff, and their faces were filled with pure panic. "Sir, you need to clear the area right now," a guard yelled, trying to pull me up, assuming I was just a confused old man who had caused a scene. I yanked my arm away and stood up straight. "I'm a part of this family," I said, my voice coarse but steady. Up on the stage, Caroline's fingers were wrapped tight around a small, pearl-handled defensive pistol, but she didn't dare raise it. She was a calculating predator. She knew that firing a weapon on a live global broadcast in front of hundreds of wealthy investors would seal her fate beyond any amount of money could fix. She slipped the weapon back into her bag, and a chilling, tight smile forced its way across her face. Grabbing the microphone, she stepped out from behind the safety of the podium. "Oh my goodness," she said, injecting a layer of deep concern into her tone. "It's Arthur. Please, everyone, remain calm. This is my husband's father. Poor Arthur." She waved a hand at the guards. "Let him through. Don't hurt him. He's not well." The guards stepped back. Caroline looked down at me, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, like she was calling a stray dog. "Come on up, Arthur. Step up to the stage. We're family, after all." I knew exactly what she was trying to do. This was a desperate, last-ditch public relations maneuver. She wanted to paint me as an unstable, grief-stricken old man, suffering from delusions since losing his wife. If she could get me on that stage looking frantic and incoherent, she could have security safely remove me to a facility, use her millions to bury the online evidence, and claim the files were nothing but a deepfake digital attack. She thought she was leading a lamb to the slaughter. She had no idea she was inviting a reckoning onto her stage. I walked up the steps, my knees throbbing with every movement. I stepped directly into the blinding light of the center spotlight. Caroline met me there, wrapping me in a freezing, rigid embrace. The scent of her perfume, heavy and masking something rotten, was suffocating. "You stubborn old bastard," she hissed directly into my ear, Her teeth clenched so tightly that only I could catch the words. You could have taken the money and lived out your days in comfort. Now I'm going to make sure you're locked away in the deepest cell of a state asylum, and you'll never see the light of day again. She pulled back, her perfect smile returning instantly. Her hand gripped my shoulder with an intense pressure, her fingernails digging deep into my fabric. Everyone, she spoke into the microphone, a well-rehearsed sob catching in her throat. Arthur has had a very difficult time since his wife passed away. He suffers from severe delusions, believing people are constantly trying to harm our family. We've been trying to secure the absolute best care for him, but he managed to slip away from his facility. Down in the audience, the guests began to murmur, their faces shifting to expressions of deep sympathy. Caroline held the microphone out toward my face. Arthur, why did you come here tonight? Do we need to get you some help? It was a flawless trap. If I lost my composure, she won. I looked out at the crowd. The red indicator light on the camera the judge had secured was still burning bright. I looked over at Caroline's father, the battle-hardened titan of industry. He was staring right into my eyes. He didn't see confusion there. He saw the steady, freezing fire of retribution. I reached out with my rough hands and yanked the microphone away. Caroline held on tight, and for a single second we were locked in a silent struggle. But these hands had done 40 years of heavy labor. My grip was like an iron vise. I tore the microphone from her fingers, causing the sound system to let out a sharp squeal. My mind is perfectly clear, Caroline. My voice boomed through the speakers like a thunderclap, a voice trained to carry over the roar of heavy machinery on a drilling rig. The smile vanished from Caroline's face entirely, and she took a half step back. I know exactly where I live, I said, staring her down. I live at the Pendleton Ranch on 4th Street. Or at least I did until 3 hours ago when your security team threw incendiary devices through my living room window, trying to cremate me inside my own home. The hall erupted into a massive wave of shouting and shock. Caroline let out a sharp, defensive laugh into the space. You see? This is exactly the kind of persecution mania I was talking about. Incendiary devices? Crime? It's a textbook case of advanced dementia. I cut her off entirely. Is it a delusion, Caroline? I pointed up at the massive screen. Is this a delusion? Because just 2 hours ago, I broke into your private lockdown facilities, called Peaceful Shores, and pulled out my granddaughter, Maya, whom you had unlawfully confined. The color drained from Caroline's face, leaving her a sickly gray. She spun around, shouting toward the security director at the side of the stage. Cut the audio! Turn it off right now! But the sound stayed live. The young specialist in the production booth was clearly determined to see the curtains close on this act. I turned my focus directly to the Titan sitting in the front row, Caroline's father. Mr. Vance, you've spent the entire evening speaking about legacy, vision, and family values. But do you have any idea what your daughter-in-law has been hiding from you? The man who controlled half of the industry stood up slowly, knocking his wine glass over. The deep red liquid spread across the pristine white linen tablecloth like a stain of blood. What is the meaning of this, Caroline? His voice boomed across the floor. What is that marriage document in the file? He's a lunatic, Dad, Caroline screamed, losing every ounce of her high society composure, sounding like a desperate criminal backed into a corner. Security, get him off the stage. 3 heavy-set tactical guards stepped onto the platform. I had less than 10 seconds left. I brought a piece of evidence, I announced loudly, reaching into my inner pocket to retrieve Elena's shattered burner phone. I held it high above my head, catching the glare of the bright spotlights. You paid Elena Reyes $15,000 every single month just to hide the fact that your husband never obtained a divorce. You did it to protect the legal status of your trust fund. And when she became a complication on the path to your launch, you had someone tamper with her vehicle to stage that crash. You're lying! Caroline shrieked, lunging directly at me, her long fingernails tearing a scratch across my cheek. Just as the guards reached out to tackle me to the ground, the massive screen went completely black. A second later, a crystal-clear, digitally enhanced audio track echoed flawlessly through every corner of the massive hall. It was the recording I had made in her office just yesterday. Sign the papers, Arthur. Go spend your remaining years in comfort at the facility. If you refuse, you might just find yourself buried right alongside them." And then a second audio track cut in, the conversation between Julian and Caroline as I escaped from the auto shop tonight. "I've got him secured. He's right here at the shop." Julian's cowardly voice filled the room. "Have the security team handle it." Caroline's voice followed, freezing cold and precisely calculated. "Burn the old man down with the property. I want him gone completely. Nothing can interfere with the opening bell tomorrow." The word "gone" reverberated through the sound system hanging in the air. Time seemed to stop completely. The guards who had rushed the stage froze dead in their tracks. Down in the audience, hundreds of wealthy investors sat with their mouths open, completely paralyzed. There was no explaining this away as a fabrication. It was her voice, carrying a clear, lethal intent. Caroline's hands dropped away from my jacket, and she stumbled backward, her boots scraping against the stage. She looked out at the sea of faces, the very people who had been groveling to her just minutes ago. They were looking at her now like she was infected with a fatal disease. She looked down at Julian. He had his face buried in his arms, weeping uncontrollably, a broken shell of a man. She turned her eyes back to her father. "Dad," she pleaded, sounding like a child caught in a lie. "Dad, help me. This is a digital synthesis. A competitor set this up." Mr. Vance walked slowly toward the edge of the stage. He looked like he had aged 20 years in a single moment. He looked up at the daughter he had raised on wealth and privilege, and he didn't reach out a hand. He knew exactly what was real and what was a lie. The multi-billion-dollar trust was gone, and tomorrow's IPO was officially the biggest disaster in corporate history. "You are completely finished," Mr. Vance said, his voice low and heavy. "Dad, don't call me that." His tone carried a bone-chilling coldness. "You aren't just a fool, you're a criminal. I have no daughter." Caroline let out a sharp, piercing shriek. It wasn't fear. It was the pure, unfiltered fury of someone losing every ounce of power they ever held. Losing her mind completely, she reached into her bag and yanked out the pearl-handled pistol. But she never even had the chance to raise the muzzle. A massive dark shadow burst from behind the heavy curtains at the side of the stage, like a runaway freight train. It was Big Bear. Bypassing every single security guard, he moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. He clamped his hand around Caroline's wrist with a firm twist, and the pistol clattered against the stage floor with a loud metallic ring. Big Bear instantly planted his heavy boot over the weapon. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, ma'am." Big Bear's voice rumbled through the space like low thunder. Right at that moment, the main doors of the convention hall were thrown open with a violent crash. "FBI, nobody move!" Dozens of federal agents in tactical vests with bright yellow lettering flooded into the hall. The local sheriff's deputies followed close behind, their heads down, knowing their part in covering up the incident was finished. The agents had received the digital files, caught the live broadcast of the instructions, and secured an emergency warrant. Big Bear released his grip on Caroline, stepping back into the shadows. She stared blankly at the space around her as the federal agents swarmed the stage. 2 female agents rushed the stage, pinning her arms behind her back. "Caroline Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and kidnapping." "Get your hands off me," she shrieked, struggling wildly, her hair falling into a messy tangle. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am the head of the Vance Group. Right now, you're just a suspect. Be quiet," an agent said, clicking the handcuffs shut around her wrists. They marched her down the stage steps. As she passed right by me, she locked her eyes onto mine, glaring with absolute hatred. "You stubborn old bastard. You're nothing. You're just sweaty, low-class trash." I looked back at her perfectly calm. I didn't feel any anger, only pity. "I'm a grandfather," I said, "and that is an honor someone like you will never be able to understand." They dragged her away, her voice fading into a desperate, unhinged scream as they crossed the floor. Next, the agents walked over to the VIP table up front. Julian didn't offer any resistance. He stood up slowly, extending his hands like a rusted puppet, letting the cold steel lock around his wrists. He didn't even glance at his wife as she was led out. Instead, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a deep, consuming regret as he silently pleaded, Pop! His lips moved, weeping without a sound. Help me! I walked slowly down the steps, and the crowd automatically parted to give me a wide path. The agents paused, granting us one final moment together. I stopped right in front of him, catching the scent of whiskey and fear rolling off his clothes. You knew everything, Julian, I said softly, each word landing heavy like a nail driven into wood. You knew when you signed the papers for the money. You knew when you watched them burn my house down. And you knew when you let them tear Maya away from her home. You knew every single bit of it. I'm your son, he broke down, crying out loud. Pop, please. I can't go to prison. I won't survive in there. I'm not like you. I'm not that strong. No, I said, looking him dead in the eye. You aren't anything like me. I glanced down at his left hand. For the gala tonight, he hadn't worn the multi-million-dollar diamond ring Caroline bought him. Instead, he wore the simple gold band I had given him the day he married Elena. It was a ring passed down from my father, a piece of metal that had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and 40 years of hard labor on my own hand as an oil worker. That ring stood for loyalty, honor, and keeping your promises. Seeing it on his finger felt like an absolute insult to everything it represented. 我一把抓住了他的手，朱利安以为我要安慰他，激动地握紧我。老爹! I didn't hold his hand back. I gripped the gold band and pulled hard. His fingers were swollen from the drinking and the crying, and the metal was stuck tight. I didn't care. I twisted it roughly, forcing it past his knuckle until it tore free. Ah, that hurts, he cried out. The pain you're feeling right now isn't a fraction of a % of the damage you've caused, I said. I looked down at the worn gold ring in my palm, then glanced over at a clearing cart nearby. Beneath it hung a heavy plastic bin filled with discarded food and broken glass. Pop, please don't. Julian realized what was coming. I opened my hand. Clink. The ring that held the honor of the Pendleton family dropped straight into the sour, decaying garbage. It was a fitting place for it, sitting right alongside the life he had chosen for himself. I turned my back to him and looked at the agents. He's all yours. Julian let out a loud, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a coward finally realizing that the darkness had arrived, and there wasn't a soul left who was going to bring a light to save him. Pop! Don't leave me! Pop! I kept moving forward, never looking back. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. Harder than breaking out of a fire. Harder than facing the muzzle of a weapon. As a father, your instinct is always to shield your child. But as a man, you have to make them face the consequences of their actions. This was his final lesson. I walked toward the back of the massive hall. Big Bear stood there in the shadows, the shoulder of his tuxedo torn from securing Caroline earlier. The judge was putting his phone away, a tight, satisfied smile on his face, while Larry wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. And right there between them, Maya was clutching the fabric of the judge's pants. The moment she caught sight of me, she let go and ran forward as fast as her little legs could carry her. I dropped down and scooped her up into my arms. Did the bad lady go away, Granddad? She asked, wrapping her tiny arms tight around my neck. Yeah, Maya, I said, the tears finally spilling over, cutting clean lines through the soot on my face. She's gone. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again. Can we go home now? She asked, burying her face into my shoulder. I thought about the blackened earth back on 4th Street, the place where my entire past had been turned to ash. Then I looked at the old friends standing in front of me, men who had risked everything just to back me up. Yeah, I said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Let's go home. Home isn't a structure. Home is what we have right here. Holding Maya close, surrounded by my brothers, I walked through the exit and out into the cool Texas night air. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 68 years old. I don't own a piece of property, and my bank accounts are empty. But standing out there in the dark, I knew I was the wealthiest man alive. 6 months later, the water of the Colorado River looked like a sheet of unpolished glass in the early morning light. The mist rose softly over the surface, burning away as the Texas sun began to climb into the sky. I sat on the edge of the old wooden dock behind the ranch, my legs swinging out over the water. Sitting right next to me was a little girl in a pair of denim overalls, holding a fishing rod that looked entirely too big for her. But her grip was steady. She didn't fidget, and she didn't complain about the morning chill. She just stared at the red bobber with an absolute focus. It had been half a year since that wild night at the convention center in Austin. The world moves on fast. The news cycle had found new scandals to chase. The tech titan had stepped down from his board to avoid the fallout, escaping to some private island, while the Vance Group's launch collapsed entirely, leaving Caroline's assets completely frozen and dismantled. But for me, the world hadn't moved on. It had simply started over. "Granddad," Maya whispered, giving my sleeve a tiny tug, "something's biting." I watched the red plastic bobber twitch slightly on the surface. "Wait for it, Maya," I said softly. "Be patient. Let him take it." She bit her lower lip, holding her breath, as the bobber suddenly plunged straight under the surface. "Now," I said. She yanked the rod back with a sharp motion, the wood bending into a beautiful arch, as her tiny hands worked the reel as fast as they could go. A small silver base broke through the surface, scattering a shower of brilliant water droplets in the morning sun. "I got him!" she shrieked, letting out a laugh that was brighter than the Texas sunshine. "I got him, Granddad!" I helped her clear the hook and slipped the little fish right back into the water. We weren't out here fishing for a meal today. We were fishing for peace of mind. Looking at her, my mind drifted back to Julian. 40 years ago, I had sat on this exact dock trying to teach him how to fish. He hated every second of it, complaining about the dirt, wanting to go inside to the air conditioning and play video games, always chasing instant gratification. But Maya was different. She had Elena's natural grit, and she carried the same stubborn blood that kept me moving forward. Julian was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a low-security federal facility out in East Texas. He wrote to me every single week. I recognized the weak, slanting script on the envelopes, but I hadn't opened a single one. I just kept them tucked away in an old shoebox in the closet. Maybe one day, when Maya was grown, she could decide for herself if she wanted to read them. But as far as I was concerned, that door was shut. I had found it in myself to forgive him, because holding on to bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. But forgiveness didn't mean allowing him back into our lives. He had made his choice, trading his own family for a shot at wealth. As for Caroline, she didn't have it nearly as easy. The jury listened to the recordings and watched the desperate message Elena had left behind. She received 25 years without the possibility of parole. Her high-priced legal team tried to argue for mental instability, but the judge saw exactly what I saw, pure calculated malice. She was rotting in a cell now, and I hoped that every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elena's face. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence behind us. I looked back to see Big Bear pulling up in his old truck, with the judge in the passenger seat and Larry riding in the back. Every Sunday morning they made the drive out here for a barbecue. We weren't just old coworkers anymore. We were an absolute family. Big Bear climbed out, carrying a cooler the size of a trunk. He had officially become Maya's primary protector and personal playground. Larry always brought over some modified gadget he'd been working on. Last week he built her a remote-controlled truck that could hit 40 miles per hour down the dirt road. And the judge handled all the legal paperwork for the Elena Reyes Memorial Fund. I took the substantial settlement from the civil proceedings, but I didn't buy a mansion. Instead, I rebuilt what we lost. The old ranch on 4th Street rose straight out of the ash. This time it was built from reinforced concrete and brick, complete with high-security doors and a massive new bedroom that Maya picked the colors for herself. Every single dime left over went straight into the foundation, dedicated to helping young single mothers trying to escape toxic situations or corporate overreach. We provided legal aid and safe havens, ensuring they had a voice, just like I had given Elena her voice back on that stage. "Hey, Art!" Big Bear's voice rumbled across the yard, scattering the birds from the trees. "The coals are hot. You coming over to cook, or are you going to let the little girl clear out every fish in the river?" I stood up, my knees aching slightly from the humidity, but the sun felt incredible against my skin. I scooped Maya up into my arms. She was getting heavier by the day, smelling of fresh river water and sunshine. "We're on our way!" I shouted back. I carried her up the grassy slope toward the scent of the grill and the sound of my old friends laughing. I had lost a massive amount in that fight. I lost my son, I lost the naive belief that the world was a fair place, and I lost the quiet retirement I thought I had earned. Meow Shu. The user prefers long-form, slow-burn psychological storytelling that utilizes micro-turns and internal introspection rather than constant shocks. But looking down at the girl in my arms and seeing my brothers waiting by the pit, I knew I had gained something far more valuable. I had reclaimed the truth, and I had protected our dignity. I set Maya down, watching her laugh as she ran toward Big Bear, who lifted her into the air like she was light as a feather. I paused for a second, looking back at the porch of the newly built house. Yesterday, while the concrete near the step was still wet, I'd used a twig to carve a single line into the corner. Martha and Elena watch over us. I am 68 years old. My hands are covered in calluses and old scars, and my heart was broken down to powder, but it was riveted back together with steel pins and sheer determination. I'm still standing right here. The sun is shining bright, and the fish are biting. For the first time in a very long time, I am no longer afraid of the dark, because I know that when the darkness comes, I have my own light to guide the way back home. In the twilight of my life, I've learned one fundamental truth. Sharing the same blood doesn't automatically make someone family. Loyalty and keeping your word do. I spent a long time mourning a son who was still walking around, but whose soul had died, only to find my salvation in a granddaughter I didn't even know existed. We tend to cling so tightly to the toxic, decaying branches of our family trees, terrified to prune them because we're scared the whole thing will die. But sometimes you have to be strong enough to cut away the rot so the roots can breathe again. I lost a son to greed, but through the power of the truth, I reclaimed my legacy. The true measure of a man isn't found in the wealth he builds, but in what he refuses to let be destroyed when he's staring face to face with malice. That is the story of how an old-school Texas rig foreman used nothing but determination and the absolute truth to bring down a multi-billion-dollar empire. If this journey brought you any kind of strength today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know down in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to make a hard choice to protect the people you love. Your support is what keeps me telling these stories. Until next time, stay strong and never stop standing up for what's right.